Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Assembly of First Nations, Our Children, Our Future, First Nations Child and Family Services and Self-Determination. Bienvenue tout le monde à l'Assemblée des Premières Nations, Nos enfants, notre avenir, service à l'enfance et la famille des Premières Nations et autodétermination. Nous sommes à notre troisième rassemblement virtuel, revendiquer la compétence en vertu de la loi concernant les enfants, les jeunes et les familles des Premières Nations. We are welcome to our third virtual gathering, asserting jurisdiction under an act respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth, and families. So this is the third of 5. So if you missed our first two, I'll give you a little summary of what happened the last one, so don't worry about it. As per our tradition, we'll start our day, and we are fortunate once again to be joined by Elder Sakani, who has been opening our sessions and closing our sessions so far. So this is number 3, and he gets better and better as he does it. So just so that everyone knows that although he might make a mistake today, he won't make it next time. With that, I would like to introduce Elder Sakani. The floor is yours.
Thank you much, Matthew. What Jake Missaway? Oma Ganagashkatia, Wajakache, Fatamane Nigan. Greetings to everyone. And to this session of Our Children, Our Future. And I just said it in my language. Matiga Ginaskal, Nutano, Kishamanto, Kina, Katabejigin, Miss Webago, Oma Nagawi Taski, Ogamaga, Pamatizon, Kapeche. I just like to greet my great creator, the creator of all things, and also to all of you, that he looks after you as we conduct ourselves in this meeting. From our hearts, from our hearts we will speak. Nagiskagawak na mojamak na boko makashako o targatayan pitabego katama Fort Albany, Mr. Gojinwa. Yeah, I also like to greet my spiritual grannies and grandpas of this ancestral land. My community is called Pitabego, which is Fort Albany in the English and French language. Ogamaganesta kino okay. And they take Miss Webu, the Wachimo, the Vokama, the Gomoshama Koshako, and to all of you, wherever you may be, wherever you're located, I also greet the spiritual grannies and grandpas of your area. Look at you now. Look after us. The Magamana, take pity on us. And the Maganoshitaya, Hakozim. Manchushana, COVID-19 at Tonawa. To watch over us, to have pity on us as we deal with COVID-19 and its virus that's come to our country. Ogomaganesta, Naskatumo, Notano, Nagachik, Anagi, Awashak, Ogomaganesta, Pushkabamatazichik. I also ask the great creator to look after the children and the new ones. Anama Akuz and Depeche Spanik during the virus that has come our way. Ogomaganesta Anigega Niganachik, and to our leaders that are leading our people, Ogomaganesta Ogomakana Ogomakanija. And also to all our chiefs and our councils right across this country. Take care. And Ogomaganesta Aniga Abitizichik. Ayafen. Migwashetawak. Anamaganochik Tachik. Abitizwan. And Nesta Nichininoak. Kanochitachik. I also want to give great thanks to the staff of AFN, who are dealing with a lot of issues that affect our people. Ugumaganesta Nagawi Taski, Wichihinan, Koispuganaliche Zo. And also ask the great creator that we look after Mother Earth in a good way. I have finished my prayer and I thank all of you. Have a good meeting. Have a good meeting. Miigwech.
Miigwech for that. That's a beautiful picture, by the way. Let everyone know what's happening in the picture behind you.
Oh, this is a picture of one of our Indian days we hold in August. And those are actual northern lights. They were shining yesterday, but I didn't go out and see them. It's too cold. It's too cold this time of year. So anyway, that's a picture of our Indian days. We gather up here every August, late August, and hopefully, like I told the group, we'll be able to do it this year too.
Very much. Thank you very much for opening our session, always grounding us and setting us in a good way. So Miigwech for that. I do have a couple of things I want to go through before I bring up the regional chief in terms of providing some opening comments. I do want to go over the agenda that we have planned for you today. You'll notice that, well, the regional chief will always give us an update on the activities that are happening with the Chiefs Committee. So we'll look forward to that. We'll also be listening, transitioning from delegated agencies to First Nations jurisdiction. And we have 3 guests who will be joining us also with for that conversation. Kawissis First Nations was talking about a model for asserting jurisdiction in child and family. So that'll be interesting. Someone that's actually in the process of developing their act or actually pass an act. So it'll be interesting to see what that is. We'll look at liability considerations for transitioning to First Nations jurisdiction over child and family services. And then we'll close the day for the day. So that's 3 different key agenda items, or 4 different agenda items, if we include the regional chief giving us an update. So it's going to be an interesting conversation today. I did want to go a little bit over what was discussed so far for those of us those of you who are just joining us. I realize that this is the 3rd episode, and you might have missed the first 2 episodes, so I want to make sure you're up to speed before the drama continues in virtual session number 3. So in terms of last session, as per usual in terms of these sessions, Regional Chief did give us an update. First Nation leadership was working towards the full implementation of the legislation, and the AFN Chiefs Assembly had established a Chiefs Committee on Child and Family Services and Self-Determination in 2019 by resolution. The Chiefs Committee provided advice, guidance, and recommendations to First Nations leadership for the transition to an implementation of the Act. The protocol agreement that was signed between the AFN and the federal government defined how Canada and First Nations would work together in the implementation of the Act. It was essential that all implementation policies affirmed First Nation rights and laws and supported First Nations capacity development. I see you notice on the screen, that's the agenda. So this is our update, but this is what we'll talk about today. Regional Chief discussed how First Nations could create their own laws within their traditional governance systems. He also stated that in terms of the funding, Canada announced $542 million over 5 years to support the implementation of the Act, including $425 million to support capacity building. Regional Chief Hart said that the funding fell way short of what was required by First Nations, and the Chiefs Committee was disappointed in the amount of funding made available. In most cases, First Nations needed to build their systems from the ground up, which included establishing their laws within reinvigorated traditional governance systems, negotiation with the province, ensuring that principles of the legislation were met, and setting up entire systems to care for children and families. So the Regional Chief will join us shortly and also provide us an additional update. We are also joined by Richard Gray, who presented on understanding notice provisions under the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. Richard provided a detailed presentation on notice, personal information, and representations and party status under sections 12 and 13 of the Act. He also provided information on notices regarding exercise of legislative authority, such as the importance of Indigenous governing groups, giving notice it intends to exercise its legislative authority. Also, legislative authority exercising jurisdiction and possible steps to support and improve implementation. The IGBs which are back referred to with an IGB as Indigenous Governing Body, are encouraged to exercise their jurisdiction through providing Section 12 and 13 notices, forcing service providers to respect clinical legal responsibilities. All Indigenous governing bodies are encouraged to give notice they intend to exercise their legislative authority under Section 20-1, and if desired, to request negotiations under Section 20-2 for coordination agreements. Keep in mind that there are no requirements that the First Nation has fully or partially developed its laws before giving notice, and no need to depend on an agreement for First Nations laws to have effect. More details of Rich's presentations are available on the AFN website. All the presentations last month and the ones that will be coming up today will be available on the AFN website. Mary Ellen Tapel-Lafond joined us, and this was their second meeting, establishing and authorizing Indigenous governing bodies under the Dr. Tapel-Lafond presented presentation focused on IGBs and First Nation governments were supported when building a new system or renewing an existing system. For information, she presented built on the first presentation she gave at the first virtual gathering on January 19th. For this presentation, she focused specifically on the issue of governance and government powers and who could exercise and develop new laws for children and families. Key points from her presentation. It affirms inherent rights to self-determination, including inherent right to self-government in Section 35 of the First Nations Self-Government over Children and Families. Nations can develop, create, and pass their own laws, revitalize practices, and these will further replace standards and principles. First Nations laws will be paramount, shared, or vacate grant authority for children and family matters in another entity. Nation building and needs a fresh context, not an Indian Act approach. Further government mandates not required, inherent rights affirmed in Section 92. The law or the legislation can work with existing agencies doing transitions, or the government can work with existing agencies. In fact, might be necessary given its expertise and service experience to build with them. So there is support out there to help build your systems. Drew Lafond, who joined us, was the president of the Indigenous Bar Association, spoke about the lawmaking authority and the ability of Indigenous nations under the Act. Under the Act, the legislation really was the first of its kind to explicitly create space in child and family, an area in the child welfare, and enactment of Indigenous laws and the enforcement of laws. It would be tricky and difficult to discuss only one subject area when discussing the enactment and enforcement of Indigenous laws. It was a forward-thinking approach to lawmaking outside the Indian Act. It was challenging an unfamiliar space and required people to think outside the box. Communities would never get past the conversation of implementation and enforcement if they did not discuss the fundamental assumptions of their nation as a whole, such as the development of constitutions. A constitution would establish different branches of laws and authorities, lawmaking and dispute resolution, and would have to be recognized by external systems, including provincial and federal governments. There were three main avenues that First Nations could take to exercise rights to child sovereignty now that Bill C-92 was enforced, and that included creating their own model without any reference to legislation, operating under existing ad hoc system, and enacting a law using Bill C-92 and their own authority. Just quick reminder, that's just a quick little overview. All the details and all the presentations are available on the AFN website. I did want to go a little bit over some announcements in terms of respecting yourself and respecting everyone else. What I'm trying to do in this session is make sure that you all be able to participate. There's the waving hand function on the side. There's a plenary Q&A button on the left-hand side. So if you have questions, do send them in and I'll provide them to the presenters. Do take care of yourself, be present, be able to participate. We do have a helpline. Sometimes the conversation is not an easy one, so you'll need to talk. The Hope for Wellness helpline is available to provide support at 1-855-242-3310 or connect to the online chat at hopeforwellness.ca. Reminder that you can ask questions, and I did say that. The waving hand functions on the right-hand side and the plenary Q&A is on the left-hand side. And also just to note that we have a limited amount of time, so sometimes we might not be able to get to all questions, but we are tracking them all, and we will follow up on all the questions that are provided. So even if we might not get to your question, do send it in because we will make sure we follow up with it. If you're listening by teleconference, please email your questions to c92forum@afn.ca. C92forum@afn.ca. This email address is provided for your confirmation email. So you got this already during your confirmation email. We have staff that will be monitoring this email address throughout the day. If you are trouble accessing us or you're having technical difficulties, we have a number to call, so we want to make sure everyone has the ability to participate. 1-833-236-8324, and that started about an hour ago, and we'll go right to 4 p.m. So if you have problems, do call that number. All the PowerPoint presentations today will be available on the website, on the AFN website. So we do have a few objectives, and the objectives are consistent over the 5 sessions. Learn about new Indigenous Child and Family Services legislation. Hear a dialogue amongst First Nations service providers and government officials about the Act, priorities for First Nations implementing the Act, and changes that come with implementation. To hear input from the elders and former First Nations youth and child on systemic reforms needed. Share emerging promising practices from First Nations implementing the Act, and I think that's where we are today, where we hear a lot of best practices out there. Understand the new tools for First Nations children, youth, and communities, and support the best interests of the child. So do check out the website. Also, all our presenters, in lieu of their huge fees that they demand, because they're such experts in the area, their per diem is going to be donated to the Mama Wee Chiita Center, which offers programs for youth and from care, so youth in transition from care. The Luma Native Housing Society Aboriginal Youth Mentor Program, I believe that's in Vancouver, supports former youth in care that are at risk of homelessness by providing mentorship, workshops, field trips, and building community connections. So I do want to thank all our presenters and all our experts out there for being willing to provide their per diem to those 2 organizations. I don't know if I introduced myself. My name is Matthew Kershane. I'm Matthew Kershane. Matthew Kershane, I'll be your host throughout the day today. With that, I'd like to introduce Regional Chief Kevin Hart, who is the Manitoba Regional Chief and the National Portfolio Holder for Social Development Files at the AFN, including Child and Family Services. Regional Chief Hart is also the Chair of the Chiefs Committee on Child and Family Services and Self-Determination. Welcome, Regional Chief Hart.
Good morning, Mr. Kershane. Tanse everybody, bonjour. I want to greet everybody here from the beautiful Treaty 1 territory on the Saugeen First Nation. It's a very cool, crisp day here this morning in the Treaty 1 territory, and I greet everybody from all your traditional territories across this beautiful land here. As the Assembly of First Nations Social Development National Portfolio Holder and the Chair of the Chiefs Committee on Child and Family Services and Self-Determination, it is indeed again my honor to welcome all the Chiefs, Elders, youth, and all our invited guests to this 3rd session here today in the series of gatherings on the new Indigenous Child and Family Services legislation. I know that you heard a lot in the media of late. I want to give everybody a fast update on what we're hearing out there on COVID-19. You're hearing in the news that there's 2 vaccines and now a 3rd that have been approved. You see that we've just come out of a big wave and that First Nations are still being affected. So, my heart goes out to all the families and the leadership still there, and everybody on the front lines protecting our communities each and every day. And that, we're almost there in flattening the curves in some of our regions respectfully. Let's be diligent, let's be mindful, and make sure that we protect our elders, our women, and especially our children right now. As you know, as part of our series here In our first meeting, for example, we heard from our knowledge keepers and youth who experienced in child and family services, who shared with us their experiences as well as their visions for the future. So this is firsthand elders that have aged out of care, of course, children that have just recently, youth that have just recently aged out of care, sharing, their experiences as well as what they would like to see in terms of change within the system, and change that's led by the people, hearing from such like knowledge keepers and youth as well. We also heard from Mary Ellen Pelofon, who explained the significance of the Act and its potentials to create change for First Nations children, youth, and families. And we also heard from Minister Mark Miller, who joined us to share with Indigenous Services Canada and what they're doing to further the implementation of the Act. In our second session, we heard from one of our colleagues, Mr. Richard Gray, on notice provisions and the obligations for Indigenous governing bodies and service providers under the Act, which is very important. So again, going back to what Mary Ellen Terpel-Lafont spoke about, in establishing and authorizing Indigenous governing bodies, leaders heard about which type of organizations could represent their First Nations and how to affirm their governing body under the Act. We also heard from Drew Lafone, president of the Indigenous Bar Association, who joined us to speak about preparing laws under the Act. He shared with us different legal obligations, useful resources also for implementing First Nations laws under the Act, and how to apply First Nations child and well-being laws. And speaking of laws, to start us off today, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that it's been over 1 year, a couple days ago, since the passing of the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and families. And I want to thank the chiefs, the knowledge keepers out there, and especially, being guided by the voices that we heard from youth with their shared experiences in the system. Today, in fact, we have a First Nation here in my region in Manitoba, the Peguis First Nation, who will just in a very short while here are doing their community celebration today as First Nations under C-92, where they're establishing sovereignty and jurisdiction and writing their own laws in respect to this Act respecting First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. So my hats off are going out to Chief Glenn Hudson, the council, the people that worked on this team, as well as the knowledge keepers as well, for their hard work. So, that's a big plus. We're hearing that there's a celebration going on in one of our First Nations today in respect to what's happening in regards to C-92 and how First Nations are asserting their jurisdiction. Again, since the passing of the Act, the Chiefs Committee has often heard from First Nation leaders that there is a need for information and dialogue to assist First Nations as they go down the path to assert jurisdiction over child and family services. We hear this time and time again in our sessions. Respectfully, we've made the information available, including the presentations that you've seen in the virtual series, including in our Chiefs Assemblies with the work that we do at the Chiefs Committee levels as well too. We hope that our session here today will provide some of this much needed information, and that the insights provided here by our speakers will help us all as we move forward down the path towards First Nation jurisdiction and self-determination. Back in December of 2020, not too long ago here, Indigenous Services Canada has received letters and documents from 26 Indigenous groups representing over 80 communities, respectfully, expressing their intent to assert their jurisdiction over child and family services. This represents a significant step forward, not only towards reducing the number of First Nations children and youth in care, but towards increasing the overall well-being of our children, families, and communities in our nations as we work towards reconciliation and towards self-governance and self-determination for First Nations. In today's session, you'll see we have a distinct honor of hearing from First Nations who have practical experience implementing their own laws and asserting their jurisdiction. Beginning the day here today, we'll have Regional Chief Paul Prosper, who will be joined by Heather Mcneil and Jacqueline Paul of their distinct Migma Initiative, and they'll share their insight with us about transitioning from delegated agencies to First Nation jurisdiction. We'll also hear firsthand experience how to work within the existing delegation agreements while exercising jurisdiction under the Act, and what the transition experience is like. Next, we'll also be joined by Chief Cadmus Delorme of the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan. Under his leadership, Cowessess First Nation has made history by passing its own child and family services legislation. The Mio Pamatsasewan Act, he will be sharing with us the invaluable experience and insight of the Cowessess First Nation to asserting jurisdiction over child and family services and developing their own First Nation child and family services legislation. Rounding off the day, also today, we'll hear from Eileen Vanderberg, from Alexander Holberg, Bodrin, and Lang LLP. They'll be here to discuss the liability considerations for transitioning to First Nation jurisdiction over child and family services. We have the opportunity to hear from the legal experts about the current legal considerations and possible liabilities when implementing First Nation laws under the Act and transitioning jurisdiction, as well as how to apply First Nations child and family well-being alongside provincial and territorial laws. You know, in closing, I just want to say that I want to thank all the leaders, the technicians, and others who have joined us here today, a year after C-92 has come, and that we see First Nations asserting their sovereignty. We see them asserting their jurisdiction. You know, we come to you today and we ask everyone to join us with open minds and open hearts to listen to experts, practitioners, and leaders from all across the country to discuss this new legislation. I hope that the information that you hear today can be shared at gatherings across this country and within your region, and it will be useful to you as well as you embark on your respective journeys towards asserting jurisdiction over the services of our children and families, whether you're choosing to do that by the Act or by other means. Hearing from First Nations about firsthand experiences about occupying the field of child and family well-being will be inspirational for all of us, and that's what I hear when I lift up the leadership from Peguis First Nation today. And we will walk away from today's session with new experiences and knowledge to do this work in a good way, guided by our languages, cultures, ceremonies, protocols, and traditions. I ask you all, brothers and sisters out there, to keep our children and families from the past, the present, and the future in your hearts. As we discuss these important matters today, I thank you for joining us, and thank you again for our speakers for sharing their experience and their insight with us. Please, everyone, be safe, wear a mask, hand sanitizer, gloves if you have to go out to shop for essentials. Please, let's be mindful, let's be vigilant. If you have the opportunity, we've heard from the federal government that all Indigenous people should be vaccinated by the end of Q2, which means by the end of this summer of 2021. So, you know, us as leadership are going to hold the federal government to task on that and ensure that, you know, us as First Nations are prioritized in that vaccination effort. So thank you, everyone. Be safe. Love and prayers out to you all in your respective territories this morning. Hi, hi.
Mkk Regional Chief, thank you for that nice overview and also providing us with an overview of our day today. So Mkk for setting the stage for us today. I believe you'll probably be around in case there's some pressing issue. We'll come and see you with those questions. So Mkk Regional Chief. With that, we'll go transitioning to our first panel conversation. And our conversation is really transitioning from delegated agencies to First Nations jurisdictions. We are joined by AFN Regional Chief Paul Prosper. We're also joined by Heather Mcneil and Jacqueline Paul. So those are our three members. I'm hoping that they're in the green room all ready to go and coming to join me soon here on the stage. Okay, so we do have videos from all our three presenters. So our first presenter was Regional Chief Paul Prosper. He represents the Mi'kmaq Chiefs of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Regional Chief Prosper has extensive experience in Indigenous legal issues from a research, litigation, and negotiation perspective. His work has been primarily devoted to advocating for the rights of Mi'kmaq people. Heather Mcneil is legal advisor to the Mkk Guinea Jun Ak. Whoa. She is a member of the Millbrook First Nation, a mother, grandmother, and wife. She's a practicing lawyer of 25 years, and for over 21 of those years, she was a staff lawyer at Dalhousie Legal Aid Service, practicing primarily in the area of child protection, family, youth criminal law, representing the Mi'kmaq, Indigenous, and non-Indigenous clients. That's a lot of experience. Jacqueline Paul is a proud member of Mkk First Nation. I'm sure I got that wrong. She joined the KMKNO team in January 2019 as a policy analyst. Her hard work, dedication, and desire for success in this initiative earned her a promotion to project coordinator of the initiative. So I believe we have videos from all our three panelists, and then we'll open the floor for any questions. So let's start with our video, please.
Thank you, Matthew. Gwe Nidapto Bajazi. I am honored to be here, and I would like to begin by commending the AFN for hosting this virtual forum. It's certainly important for us to share perspectives, especially on a topic like transitioning from delegated agencies to First Nations jurisdiction. With me, I have Jacqueline Paul, who is the project coordinator, and Heather Mcneil, QC, who is our legal advisor for the Mkk Initiative, meaning keeping our children together. And certainly there have been a lot of people that helped us through the process of this particular initiative from a variety of areas, from government, all levels of government, within our communities, through the health directors, through the delegated agency, Mi'kmaq Family and Children Services, Legal Aid, the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association, and the list goes on and on of those people who have contributed to this very important initiative. It reflects our journey, and where we have overcome many challenges, and certainly there are more challenges that we're still facing. But as stressed by our elders, who reminded us to place our children in the middle, to remind us of why we are all working together on this initiative. This initiative that has been supported through the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, otherwise known as Gwilamuk Mwa Gluswakan. Translated in English, it means we are seeking our consensus. This is the primary organization that has helped to undertake this initiative, and we would like to share our journey with you. In the early 1960s in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq was represented by a tribal council and a provincial territorial organization known as Union of Nova Scotia Indians, representing all the 13 Mi'kmaq bands in Nova Scotia. In the 1980s, there was a separation with the creation of another tribal council known as the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Later, a number of legal cases began to take place with the amendment of the Constitution and the insertion of Section 35 within the Constitution, which led to a number of Mi'kmaq court cases involving Aboriginal and treaty rights. And with that success through litigation and court cases, there was a need for the development of an umbrella organization for the Mi'kmaq, and this was the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs, which exists as an institution of governance for the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. Currently, 11 of the 13 Mi'kmaq bands form part of the Assembly. A seat is held for the chiefs of all these communities, and as many of us probably know, there's through the course of time certain challenges to unity. Most recently, the moderate livelihood fishery issues related to adjacency and things like that, which always at times puts a certain stress on unity. And sometimes unity, when I think about it, is paper thin. So the door is always open at the Assembly level as communities decide to leave and to come back in. But the Assembly is a key governance body. It works and provides direction to staff within the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, detailing rights implementation, but also numerous consultation projects. Nova Scotia is entirely within Mi'kmaq territory. In fact, it includes 6 of the 7 traditional districts of Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. It flows from Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Quebec, and certainly parts of Maine. We have a creation story which talks about the beginnings of how Mi'kmaq people were created. We have a traditional government structure, the Sante Mawiomi, the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. We have legends and traditions and customs that allow us to trace our roots back to one of the 12 original tribes. Next slide. The Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia Canada Rights Implementation Table. This is a platform where the implementation of rights is discussed. This forum seeks to resolve issues related to Aboriginal and treaty rights. And it's important to know that within and throughout Mi'kma'ki, Mi'kmaq people have outstanding and affirmed Aboriginal and treaty rights that have been recognized by the highest courts in this country. There is a process to help discuss these issues in a structured manner known as the Maine and Nova Scotia process, which seeks to resolve issues related to treaty and Aboriginal rights. And part of that is governed through a framework agreement that has been entered into that outlines a number of specific areas subject to the negotiation process. When I think of the Maine Nova Scotia process, the key document is the Umbrella Agreement of 2002, which has 3 main components to it. One component involves a tripartite forum that deals with community programs and services, and it allows the federal, provincial, and Mi'kmaq governance to talk about these issues on a without prejudice basis. There is another arm of the Umbrella Agreement known as the Consultation Terms of Reference that allows for on the record or with prejudice discussions to take place involving consultation. And then there is the negotiation table governed by the framework agreement that allows tripartite discussions to take place on a variety of topics on a without prejudice basis. So that in a nutshell is the Made in Nova Scotia process. It seeks to help restore a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. Next slide, please. Back in 2015 is where our story begins with respect to the province through the Department of Community Services seeking to conduct a major overhaul to the Children and Family Services Act, then about 27 years old. And they were seeking to do this without any real input from our Mi'kmaq communities and the Mi'kmaq leadership. We engaged DCS. We attempted to get them to work through the consultation terms of reference. They didn't think that this matter deserved to be discussed there. So what we essentially agreed to disagree. But nonetheless, we wanted to ensure that we would work together to address these proposed amendments to the Children and Family Services Act. And it was important to note that then there were no specific provisions related to Mi'kmaq people within that act. We struck a key technical team comprised of people like Angelina Amaral, who worked for the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, Jennifer Cox, who was then and currently still a legal aid lawyer, Paul Morris, who is counsel for Mi'kmaq Family and Children Services. And this was a key technical team that came together to deal with this particular situation, which was largely process-driven. And when you're dealing with amendments to legislation, it's largely process-driven. There's firm timelines that need to be done and put together. On March 1st, 2017, the province adopted more than 25 legislative amendments to the Children and Family Services Act that deal specifically with Mi'kmaq people, communities, and families. And when we talked to leadership about this, we wanted to be clear that there was an interim process and a longer term process. And the interim process was to work with the provincial legislation to seek as much gains as we can, through that amendment process. But our larger, longer term goal was to develop a Mi'kmaq law for Mi'kmaq children and families. So, we wanted to do these in at times in parallel with one another, and we were successful in doing that. And the Assembly's Mkk Initiative was formed to address gaps within legislation that affected the well-being of our families, our youth, our children, and communities. And this initiative began in October of 2018. Next slide. So when you look at the existing situation within Nova Scotia, we have a delegated agency through the Children and Family Services Act, through the Department of Community Services. And this is Mi'kmaq Family and Children Services. There is an agreement, a tripartite agreement in 1985 that laid out the arrangements that existed between the federal, provincial, and Mi'kmaq government. And it certainly, through the Department of Community Services, they implement the Children and Family Services Act. And it's Mi'kmaq Family, who is the provincial agency throughout all of Nova Scotia. The chiefs sit as a board of directors to that. And it mostly does so, Mi'kmaq family, with a First Nations lens, and predominantly and almost exclusively deals with cases and situations involving on-reserve settings. Mi'kmaq Family and Children's Services was a key partner throughout this whole initiative. They provided the necessary support and funding and capacity to allow the necessary groundwork to begin. Within Nova Scotia, there was a lot of previous work that was done to work with the federal and provincial government on a tripartite basis. In part, that was supported through the inquiry report regarding the wrongful conviction of Donald Marshall Jr. and the report findings back in 1989 that sought to create a tripartite forum on justice. The relationship with Mi'kmaq Family and Children's Services and the Department of Community Services has been a productive one. For example, they have helped the Mi'kmaq Family conduct an audit where they looked at the current caseloads compared to the provincial caseloads. And through that audit, what they discovered was Mi'kmaq Family and Children's Services was grossly underfunded by the federal government. It led to a change in positions from roughly about 90 positions to include roughly about 160 positions, just by looking at the hardcore numbers of cases and things of that nature. So I say this to recognize DCS and their efforts throughout this whole initiative. People like Janet Nearing, Wendy Bungie, Leonard Dorian, then Minister Bernard of DCS, and certainly the current Minister Reagan. I also want to acknowledge Chief Deborah Robinson, who is the chair for Mi'kmaq Family and Children's Services, who has exhibited exceptional leadership throughout this whole process. Moving right along, next slide. A bit about an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. Bill C-92, as we all know it to be. We were engaged in that process as well. We've submitted written submissions back in April of 2019. In April 30th of 2019, myself, along with Jennifer Cox and Paul Morris, were before both the Senate and Parliamentary Standing Committees, that is, on the subject of Bill C-92. We had the pleasure of presenting with the chair, Senator Dan Christmas, for the Senate portion of those submissions. And it was a high point in my career to be in that particular forum. We also benefited from certainly the Assembly of First Nations through the Chiefs Committee on Child and Family Services and Self-Determination, and the discussions through the joint working group that took place there. So on June of 2019, a resolution was passed within the Assembly approving the name and the logo for the Mao Gulu Ginajana initiative, Keeping Our Children Together. It was sought to build a Mi'kmaq-specific child and family law, which will depart from provincial and federal legislation. You know, when you're departing from legislation, whether it be federal or provincial, it's always an important consideration, and it's something certainly that we don't take lightly. With it comes a huge responsibility. As we all know, that federal and provincial child welfare systems are inconsistent at times with traditional, cultural, and customary Mi'kmaq practices. So our initiative as well was launched before even government drafted or began discussions on Bill C-92. So to conclude, our success was supported by many. It was important to have a regional process that we had undertaken for provincial legislation, but it was certainly also very important to tap into the process initiated by the Assembly of First Nations as well. As our elders have often stressed, we place our children at the center to provide a common reference point, because our children exist as our most valuable resource. And so with this initiative, I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the people that conduct their work on a day-to-day basis. And yes, there's challenges that we face, but when we look back at the accomplishments we were able to succeed, it certainly gives me hope for a better day for our children and our families. And so with that, I will hand things over to Heather Mcneil, who is our legal advisor for the Maui Galugi Ginajana initiative. Next slide, and thank you.
G'day, friends and relatives. My name, as our moderator mentioned, is Heather Mcneil, and I'm coming to you from Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia. And I'm here to talk about the Mkk Ginajana initiative. And you heard from Regional Chief Prosper, who spoke to you about our initiative. And we want to tell you a little bit more about that now. And I guess it's important to start off with we call it the Mkk Initiative for short, but what our initiative is about. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk to you about our vision and our mission as it provides us the focus and the guidance, I guess, for the work that we do. So our first slide, or my first slide, is on the vision, and I'll say this to you, that it's about leadership, organizations, stakeholders, and community service providers coming together in a coordinated manner to work collaboratively to create a better future for our Mi'kmaq children and families. We want to create a future where our Mi'kmaq children are resilient, they're strongly connected to their culture and their community while living in safe, healthy, and nurturing homes. And our mission is to engage in a collaborative approach to the development and the implementation of a child welfare system that places the child and the family in the center and promotes healing and wellness in a manner that respects our Mi'kmaq values, our Mi'kmaq customs, our traditions, and our practices. Next slide, please. We're developing the law and the policy, and our Mkk team is tasked with really two major projects to develop, and that's the child welfare legal regime, our Mi'kmaq child welfare legal regime, and the development of policies and protocols that are going to be required to support the implementation of the law that we develop. Now we have the members of our Mkk team, about 8 of us and growing, work collaboratively to develop the law and the policies. And that's done side by side with the input from our community members and our leadership. And all aspects of the law and the policy are shared in community, with community and leadership to ensure that their perspectives, their vision of what this legal child welfare regime is going to look like are reflected through the work that we do. Next slide, please. The next slide talks about what are the priorities that are being developed, I guess, for our Mi'kmaq draft law. And we've talked to a great deal of people about, in our communities, in our leadership, our youth, our elders, our Grand Council, our experts in the area of child welfare, what should be in that law. So we've identified a number of things. These are our core principles that will be in the law. And one is our Mi'kmaq jurisdiction and governance. The second is our application to all Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. The third is development of the law with reflecting our customs, our traditions, and our ceremonies of our people. The next is our Mi'kmaq principles and values, and a lot of these have been gained through the gatherings and things that we've had with elders, Grand Council, and youth. The next is best interests of a Mi'kmaq child. And important to us as well is our child placements, and our children need to be at home in our Mi'kmaq communities. So we're looking at kinship placements and customary care placements to achieve the best results for our children. The next is the child and family involvement in decisions affecting them. Next is culturally respectful services. Those are going to be services for our Mi'kmaq families that can be trusted and that support them with a reunification plan with their children. The next is our Mi'kmaq Customary Adoption Protocol, and Jacqueline will be talking a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And the next is aging out of care. Our youth are aging out of care and need a lot of supports, and how do we do that in the best way possible so they can achieve a successful independence? Last is identification of roles of traditional and contemporary leadership and community members in the implementation. And identification of those roles of participations, we believe play a major role, in caring for a child that's in care, but also after care. So that we've identified, obviously, elders, children and youth, have participation in these processes, family, community, leadership, and our Grand Council. The next slide, please. This slide, we're going to talk to you a little bit about our Mi'kmaq legal regime and what we're doing in that. And basically, we've identified it as a three-phased approach. And as you can see there, our first phase is draft, engage with chief and councils, engage with community. Second phase is revise, then re-engage, and then talking about our symposium. Third phase is a legal review, and then after that, ratified through the Assembly, and then to implement our Mi'kmaq regime. So basically, what we're kind of in the phase 2 right now, I'd say, yeah, we're not kind of, I think we are in phase 2 now. But what we've been doing is drafting the law, and then we engage with chief and councils and community. And our engagement is also we have groups that take a look at this, what we've drafted. We have elders involved, we have leadership involved, we have Grand Council involved, Mi'kmaq Family and Children's Services, Legal Review Committee. We do it also as well through an advisory committee we have. You'll hear a little bit more about that later. Chief and council meetings. We go to Assembly for our resolutions. We have symposiums. We've had a few of those already, and we take some of this work to the symposiums and through the working groups that we have in our initiative. And again, Jacqueline will talk a little bit more about that a little later on. So we take the law out, we draft it, we have it reviewed by all these different groups and people on many of the different groups. We re-engage, we rewrite, we report back through some of those mechanisms like advisory and the Assembly and things like that. The symposiums are a great place to bring some of the work that we're doing because we reach an awful lot of people through that process. So we review with the stakeholders. We have our legal review committee that goes over from a legal lens, and then once it's all done, when we get to the third stage and we think that we have a final product that everybody's had a look at, then we're going to take it to our Assembly and to seek ratification, but only after the Assembly and the leadership reviews it. And then we would have our Mi'kmaq law developed under the legal regime. The next slide, please. I mentioned Mkk Guinea Legal Review Committee, and that committee consists primarily of Mi'kmaq lawyers. We have academics, we have professors, we have law students. So it's quite a fulsome committee that put a legal lens basically on the work that we're doing. And the reason why we developed that committee is to provide really specialist legal advice on individual drafting matters. So as we were going through this, we were developing it, we were peer reviewing this work that we're doing, and we did it in segments. So we first developed it in like 7 core segments. So, and then, kind of went through all that process I talked about on the last slide about, re-engaging and revising and things. Then we take it to the Legal Review Committee, and the Legal Review Committee takes a look at it, and then, and looks at it for things like charter compliance, administrative law, criminal laws, or anything in there that we need to be thinking about while we're drafting this law. So we did it in segments, and that broke it down a little bit easier to work with. And so we identified legal gaps that had to be addressed in the process, and And it was really to provide input on the implementation of changes to the services resulting from this new regime. What were those services going to look like? How did the law impact those services? So we have 14 members on our legal review committee, and we also have, I talk about this particular committee because it was the first one we set up, but we also have other groups that review. And one of them is, like I mentioned, was we have elders. When we have our gatherings, we take some of the work that we do to the gatherings and talk about some of those pieces of it. Our youth, our Grand Council, and Migma Family and Children's Services, which is the delegated agency in Nova Scotia. And next slide, please. This slide here is on policy development, and our MKK team includes several policy analysts who work collaboratively to build the elements of the policies that really are, those policies support the implementation of the law, and it has to be aligned with what the working groups have advised the policy analysts as to what is important for this law. And the policies developed in several stages. There's the review of the child and family legislation and policies at the federal and provincial level, and in other First Nations communities, other Indigenous communities. Understanding what are the best practices, how are these practices are going to be implemented in terms of our Mi'kmaq legal regime at the end of the day. And there has to be an understanding of best practices and how they work for Mi'kmaq communities. Our policies have to reflect our Mi'kmaq culture, traditions, knowledge, values, all of those things. It has to be within our law and within our policies. And there needs to be engagement with community members, especially the youth and the elders. Drafting of the policies have to encompass community knowledge, culture, and values, while ensuring that the family's well-being is always supported. Our review of our draft policies go through our working groups and our community members as well. So there's a whole process around policy development, and we're well into that as we are with the law right now. So I think I'll turn it over to Jacqueline to tell you more about the initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that introduction. Next, I'll be updating everyone on the Mkk Advisory Committee. So the Mkk Advisory Committee is made up primarily of representatives of Mi'kmaq organizations with interest in advancing Mi'kmaq child welfare. The Advisory Committee meets with the initiative bi-monthly, and the Advisory Committee also provides guidance and advice on Migma Initiative's activities, policies, and the development of the legal regime. We also look to the advisory for oversight and direction. Next slide, please. But for all formal direction and approval, this comes directly from the Assembly. To touch a bit on our working groups, there are 5 specialized working groups: foster care, assessments, systemic and structural barriers, facilities and family resources, and customary care and custom adoption. Next slide, please. In our foster care working group, some objectives are to examine issues and program gaps for foster and kinship parents, to identify and develop culturally appropriate resources and supports for Mi'kmaq foster parents, and to identify how we can recruit more Mi'kmaq foster parents. Next slide, please. So with the assessments working group, we look to review assessment tools used in the area of child welfare, specifically the foster care and kinship assessments, and to determine if these assessments create barriers for our Mi'kmaq families. We also look to develop a Mi'kmaq specific framework and culturally appropriate assessment tools and practices. Next slide, please. In the Systemic and Structural Barriers Working Group, some objectives are to identify systemic and structural barriers inhibiting holistic family wellness, identifying systemic and structural barriers posing challenges to accessing culturally appropriate programs and services, and to identify systemic and structural barriers posing risks and challenges within the existing child welfare system on the reunification of families. Next slide, please. Another working group is the Facilities and Family Resources, and here we explore child welfare Mi'kmaq specific facilities that support a Migma child welfare model, to develop legal processes and policies for the development and implementation of child welfare facilities within Migma standards and principles, and to identify the resources required in community which may be provided through facilities. Next slide, please. Last, and certainly not least, our Customary Care and Custom Adoption Working Group. And within this working group, we identify traditional Migma practices related to community-based parenting and care. We look to identify culturally appropriate alternative forms of community-based care for Migma families. And we also look to develop policies for the governance and implementation of traditional community-based parenting and care systems. And lastly, we look to identify processes for formalizing alternative and customary care arrangements within Migma communities. We do a lot, next slide please, sorry. So we do a lot of collaborative projects with other organizations. In addition to the legal regime and policy development being conducted by the Mkk team, work is ongoing in several other areas that supports the development of the legal regime and policy. And we will support the implementation of the law and policies once finalized. Some of this work is undertaken by the Mkk team, while other aspects are headed by other Migma organizations and supports of the work of the Mkk team. Next slide, please. So the Mcneil program is a Migma family group circle, which is family group conferencing. The circle process is to help resolve conflict, repair the harm, and restore relationships. And inherent to the process of the circles is the principle of accountability to all stakeholders, ensuring Migma children are safe and there is respect for the responsibility of the family and care and community to care for the children. So the use of Migma circles, the process or the Mkk contributed to more Migma children going into kinship and customary adoption care placements, and in some cases, Migma customary adoptions. Next slide, please. So the Mkk Migma customary adoption protocol is something that we have developed, and this protocol is to create a structure where Migma Family and Children Services will be able to use the customary adoptions to address child welfare matters. We want to create a process that is respectful and honors the customs of our communities, and to create a process that forms an alignment between customary and statutory laws that could work within current child welfare systems. Next slide, please. So to elaborate a bit more on Migma customary adoption protocol, this offers an alternative to be considered in plans of care and in permanency planning for Migma children. It provides culturally appropriate way for Migma families, communities, and organizations to plan for children. The protocol respects the traditions, practices, and customs of each band. It also takes into consideration that what is in the best interest of a Migma child includes the child's cultural and collective rights. And it is a way of ensuring a child maintains their culture, their linguistics, and their spiritual identity. The custom adoption protocol did go before the Assembly in October of 2020 and was passed in principle that we go to each First Nation in Nova Scotia seeking a BCR, a Band Council resolution. Next slide, please. Our youth initiative. So on our team, we do have one youth coordinator, and they engage with the Migma youth from all over Nova Scotia. They've had multiple community engagements, and the purpose of these meetings were to explore the law with the youth and get their perspective on our Mi'kmaq regime. Currently, we have met with over 200 youth across Nova Scotia. We have implemented land-based activities as part of the engagement strategy to youth to provide a more natural environment where we can teach our youth practices, traditional practices, while learning from them about their experiences and vision for child welfare. Next slide, please. So what you see before you is our Knitaway app. And Knitaway, when translated, means I speak. And this is giving a voice to youth in care. This is a legal information app that is targeted to reach the youth, yet does have a multi-function use. And you're able to access this on your desktop or by your phone. The icons that you see up there are all taken from Mi'kmaq petroglyphs. We are working as well to have all the content translated, so it will be available in English and in Mi'kmaq. All design and content has been drafted, and this has gone before our assembly multiple times. And we expect this to launch by the end of the fiscal year. So this could be in the hands of our people very, very soon. So stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. The Band Designate Program. So prior to January 2020, there was no designated individual at the band level to support families and the chief and council with legal matters involving families in the community. Through a proposal submitted to ISC, funding was secured to provide each Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia with a designated band employee for this purpose, relieving some of the burden on chief and council and providing a dedicated resource. We currently have band designates in 12 of our 13 communities to represent their First Nations before the courts on child welfare matters. And the Mkk team is developing a common band policy to aid in aligning approaches and resources across communities. And in October of 2020, the Mkk Initiative was given direction by the Assembly to develop a band designate common policy, and that will just set some of the minimum standards across the board. Next slide, please. Guardian ad litem. Under the Provincial Child and Family Services Act, children and youth can be provided a guardian ad litem to represent them in legal proceedings if they are unable to instruct counsel in child welfare proceedings themselves. When the Mkk Initiative began, the team was able to identify very few guardian ad litems, and the majority of guardian ad litems available were not Mi'kmaq community members. So our team worked further to develop capacity of the existing guardian ad litems and the work with potential new guardian ad litems to ensure that they can better understand and represent the distinct needs of Mi'kmaq children in a provincial legal system. In light of the training, there has been an increase of Mi'kmaq coming forward to act as guardian ad litems in child protection hearings involving our children. You can also find more information on how to become a guardian ad litem at our website at www.mi'kmaqrights.com, and you'll find it under the child welfare link. Next slide, please. So to conclude our presentation here today, the Mkk Initiative is a Mi'kmaq-centered approach to exercising self-governance and jurisdiction over child welfare matters for Nova Scotia families, for Mi'kmaq families in Nova Scotia. The work of the Mkk Initiative, while innovative in some aspects, relies heavily on the return to traditional and cultural practices, as well as the successes seen in other Indigenous communities in Canada and internationally. The Migma child welfare regime will support holistic family wellness and step away from colonial practices of separation. The entire family stands at the center of this process, and the wellness of the parents and community at large is equally as important to the success of the child as the child's independent success and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I was just saying, I was just thinking that you guys recorded this like 3 weeks ago, but you're still in the same rooms that you recorded in. So thank you for waiting for us in terms of our questions. So thank you, Regional Chief, for being here, Jacqueline and Heather. We do have a couple of questions from the floor. Great presentations, by the way, very informative. The first question is around funding to do all the stuff that you're doing. Where are the costs? How are you covering the costs? And also another thing, I like the MKK. I like acronyms like that, a lot easier to pronounce. So there was a funding question.
Maybe I'll begin and then I'll just look to Heather or Jackie to provide further detail. In the beginning, it was kind of tough because, you know, we sort of were blindsided by the province when they initiated their review of the Children and Family Services Act. But thankfully, the relationship we had with Migma Family and Children Services was a productive one and exists still today. So they provided a key component of the seed money that was available for us to do the initial work. And then our relationship with DCS also kicked in some further funding as well. So it gave us that momentum to initiate things and get some immediate gains. And then it was dealing with Indigenous Services Canada for this initiative, which was multi-year. But I'll look to Heather and Jackie to provide anything further. Thanks.
I think you're dead on. It was a 5-year, multi-year funding as to risk. And that, I think that came out close to the end of either 2017 or 2018. I was the first employee for the initiative, and that was in September of 2018. So we were just getting started at that point.
Sorry, Heather. The question also was talking about the time frame. I think the legislation talks about 12 months, right, when you give notification. But you obviously started this work way ahead of that. So I guess, are you then joining the 12-month time frame at a certain, you know, as articulated in the legislation? I guess that was a second question. What are the time frame under the legal regime? So I guess, I don't know how that works. Go ahead, sorry.
So we have it for 5 years. We started this work prior to Bill C-92 being on the table at all. And so that's what we're going with, the 5-year. We have 5 years to do the work that we're doing, and we're carrying on in that respect for now.
So do you join the 1 year under C-92 at a certain point, or will you decide that at a certain point, or is that already part and parcel of this group?
My understanding is leadership is, they don't want to forgo any options with respect to which regime that they would fall under, whether it be, you know, the act itself or just to have full recognition outright on the basis of our existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. So there's two sort of potential streams in that scenario. And as Heather outlined earlier, there is a process by which we are looking to enact our law. And, you know, we're mindful of timelines, but we're also mindful of ensuring that our leadership in our communities are ready for this.
What have you seen as the greatest challenge moving forward, or the challenges that I think you identified a few, Regional Chief, but in terms of, are you anticipating any challenges moving forward?
Well, if I can just add a bit to that, you know, we have a great relationship with DCS, and I know that they're quite keen on understanding what our process is. So that's one of them. Another one, which, you know, there were a number of people that came together where at times, traditionally, when you're looking at a delegated agency to deal with children and families within our community. You can only imagine some of the relationships that have evolved from that, whether it be health directors or Native women, or even legal aid and, the Migma family, the delegated agency. And as mentioned by Jackie and Heather earlier, it was a concerted effort to put our children in the center. And with that came sort of like this commitment amongst the parties to work together for the betterment of our children and our families. So getting over that initial challenge, I think, was key.
I think another thing to add to it is COVID. COVID has hampered some of the work we've been doing. I suspect that's the case for many First Nations communities across the country. Things that we wanted to take to community and sit down and just have a good heart-to-heart talk, a face-to-face, and flush things out. It's not quite the same. We've on Zoom and WebEx and things like that. We do it, but I'm not sure it's the best way to do it. But we are where we are, and then until maybe the end of the summer or maybe next year, I'm hoping things will change and we can get back out to communities again. But that did hamper us for a little bit, but we were able to step up to the challenges everybody else has to.
The question I have here, and I'm just reading the question. I'm not saying I understand it, but will your Migma family services continue to deliver services upholding your laws through jurisdiction, or will that agency be dissolved? I'm wondering, is that because C92, pre-C92 and post-C92? Maybe that's the question.
That's a very good question. And it's something we thought about, and we're sort of in that process of, as mentioned by Heather and Jackie, of putting the necessary groundwork and foundation in place with respect to the transition from Migma family, the delegated agency, to the law. There, it's anticipated that there will be a transition. And, when that will happen, largely depends on the will of communities and leadership and people like that. I don't have a firm timeline, and certainly Jackie and Heather, if you want to add to that as well.
I don't think there's a firm timeline either. A lot of it's the work that we're doing. We take it out to community, and then community and leadership tell us really what's the next steps kind of thing. And we've talked about transitioning and what that might look like, but we haven't firmly developed that piece of it yet.
I guess I'm wondering, the next question I had was this is something around capacity. I guess you're having a conversation about something that's not necessarily easy to understand either, right? At the community level and even with families and with parents and stuff. So I'm wondering about the capacity. Are you working on the local capacity, doing an education piece to bring people along as you're doing this work?
I'm thinking of you for this one, Jackie.
Sure. So like Heather had mentioned, COVID has impacted how we're engaging with community. We are trying to do online engagements, and really we do and are working towards making everything very plain language, taking a lot of the legal jargon and social work jargon out of it and making it very simple for everyone to understand. And that's what we hope to accomplish with the Netaway app as well, is just having very plain legal information there for youth to access in ways that they can understand, because it's really not beneficial to anyone if we have the material out there, but it's not applicable. So.
The other thing, just if I can add, the other thing that helps along capacity lines is the fact that we have 25 amendments to a provincial child welfare legislation, and what that has allowed was the development of capacity not only within the agency but also within the respective Migma organizational groups. So that has helped as well as a foundational piece.
At one point, Regional Chief, you mentioned two tables, one with prejudice and one without prejudice. And I'm glad Heather's here so it can explain what does that mean.
Sure, it's a process. And when you're talking about outstanding Aboriginal and treaty rights related issues, it can get very complex quite quickly. But this process is guided under a central umbrella, the umbrella agreement, and it has three distinct attributes. The tripartite forum that tends to deal with bread and butter issues at a community level, programs and services. So those tripartite discussions can take place on a without prejudice basis because they were being used in court at one time. Then the second arm involves a consultation terms of reference, which is the preferred means of the Assembly to deal with consultation related issues. And obviously those are with prejudice on the record discussions. And then the third component being the negotiation table itself, guided by a framework agreement, itemized subject areas, and those take place on a without prejudice level. So this initiative, the Mkk Initiative, can utilize, for example, the main table discussions to have some key areas addressed throughout the initiative. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering how that all works. Now, this maybe is just a question for me, and this is my own curiosity, only because I'm not living near my community. I'm wondering, the future vision in terms of responsibility, taking responsibility for all Mi'kmaq children, no matter where they reside. Is that something you're contemplating or engaging, or I'm not even sure what the process would be. Like, I think you had some processes where it's in community. Is there like expanding it to say the cities in the province or even outside of province?
I look to Heather to.
Heather?
Well, at this time, the direction that we've been given to date from leadership is that it'll apply to all Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, which includes on reserve and off the reserve.
So within the province?
Within the province of Nova Scotia only, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our session. So I do want to thank you all. Awesome presentation. I hope I didn't throw too many wrenches in there with those questions, but most of them came from the floor. So something that's very important to our participants. So Miigwech, thank you for joining us, Jacqueline and Heather, and do stay safe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With that, we come to a point in our agenda where we all take a pause. And usually we don't do that. We're not very, we just keep plugging through because we have about 60 questions. But unfortunately, we do have an opportunity to take a quick break. So let's take a quick break. Let's reconvene at 1:45 Eastern time. So if you're east, you're an hour later. If you're west, your hours sooner. So at the 1:45, so let's reconvene at the 1:45 the hour. Thank you, everyone, and we'll be back at whatever hour 45. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Children Our Future First Nation Child and Family Services and Self-Determination, our virtual gathering, our third virtual gathering, asserting jurisdiction under the Act. Just a few, I'm just going to invite our next guest up to speak a little bit around their laws and the implementation or the development of their laws. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone about the questions. So you have the question Q&A on the left-hand side of your screen. You can ask a question there. I think you have a hand-raising function too. You can actually ask questions or in the player Q&As. What happens is those questions get sent to me via the platform, and then if I have time, I get to try, I ask those questions. If, however, we don't have time, we will follow up with every question. There was a couple of questions I didn't get to the last session, but we will follow up with you. So we will go and contact the presenters, get a question, get the answers from them, and share that with all your participants. Again, you can email your questions at c92forum@afn.ca. So c92forum@afn.ca, and we'll be sure to get our best to make sure that we get those questions up for you. With that, what I'd like to do is invite Chief Cadmus Delorme, who is Cree and Soto and a citizen and current chief of the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan. Not often do you get the opportunity to see Cowessess First Nations in Saskatchewan and say so many S's at the same time. So, I mean, that's a lot of S's, but that's good. It sounds pretty good. I mean, lots of S's, and with Chief Delorme joining us. So, hello, Chief Delorme. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm good.
You all ready to go? You have your presentation?
I am.
That's a beautiful painting behind you, by the way. There's 3 of them there. That's a nice.
Oh,
I believe that gentleman is from Saskatchewan who painted that one.
he is. He's an old golf buddy and good mentor. His name was Ken Lonechild.
Really? I think I have one of Ken's here in my office somewhere. It's beautiful.
He has a brother named Michael. They're both amazing artists.
Wow. Beautiful stuff. Well, sorry, we would have a conversation about art, but we're not here to talk about art. We're here to talk about your laws and how the work that you've done in your community. So with that, please welcome Chief Delorme, and the floor is all yours, Chief.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to give praise to Ed for the rendered prayer this morning. I'm coming to you from Treaty 4 territory, Cowessess First Nation. The next 40 minutes to 45 minutes, I get very excited about talking about this, so I could tend to talk really fast. I get the most feedback in the questionnaire. So I'm going to tell a story version and get very specific on the child welfare approach that Cowessess First Nation has taken. So the Cowessess First Nation, we are a signatory to Treaty 4 territory. We're in Southeast Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory, and we are the biggest First Nation in Treaty 4. We have 4,300 citizens living throughout central Western Canada. 900 live on the reserve. Since 1951, when the Indian Act was amended and citizens were able to leave the reserve, we now have 3rd and 4th generations living in places like Vancouver and other areas. And sometimes when we go meet with those citizens, when we do our Christmas tours, some of them have never stepped foot on Cowessess First Nation before. So we're dealing with citizens throughout. And one of the great things about Bill C-92, I mean the act when I say that, is that this is coast to coast to coast. We are reassessing the way that our relationship is, Cowessess First Nation, with our citizens. And it's not border reserve approach, it's coast to coast to coast. And so it's really exciting to embark on such a law that is going to be discussing just that. I wanted to start off by just introducing, before I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, one of the first things that Cowessess had to address, it was even bigger than C-92, and it was our healing journey. What does that mean? What does it mean to heal? What does it mean to stop putting up our shields and blocking the colonization, and sometimes our own worst enemies were ourselves and our own thoughts. I was elected chief in 2016, and I grew up on Cowses. I graduated from here. I left to go to university, and I was very honored when my citizens elected me chief in 2016. And for decades, Cowses has been healing. And so we started to approach healing in many different perspectives. And it really led us to understanding, were we or were we not ready to introduce C-92, and then now we have our own legislation. And so we started to really assess some of the core things in our nation. And I just wanted to mention some of those things, because in the story I'm telling you is I'm going to get very specific with the coordination agreement that we are at the final stages, the act that we have. But I just wanted to get back to my first opening comment in regards to, was Cowses really ready for C-92? And when we say that we're healing, we're going to start asserting and not trying to convince. We're going to start making sure that Cowses is the driver, no longer sitting in the backseat. You know, we had to highlight that our political control has been driven from an Indian agent mentality, from an Indigenous Services Canada perspective, that we were always having to report to Canada. We weren't really reporting to our citizens. So who are we really accountable to in our political control? So we had to readjust our governance structure, and we have been doing that in a nation building perspective. Our social control, Facebook, all you gotta do is go on Facebook and see how, you know, the negative and the, the lateral violence and real the social control. We have to make sure that we really ready to understand what our healing is from a social control. Our spiritual control, we don't discriminate as long as people have faith. If it's to a religion, if it's to spirituality, faith is the main thing that we drive. We're a very diverse nation. Our health control, Cowses, Indigenous people in general across Canada, we're prone to live 10 years less. Diabetes is rampant, everything like that. So are we really in control of our health? Our economics, that's something that we've been driving. Our language control, one of the things we realized when we were really assessing our healing journey was, is our Indigenous language still sleeping within us? And 3 years ago, less than 10 citizens on Cowses, from Cowses, not 10%, less than 10 citizens fluently spoke one of our languages, which is Cree. And so we applied for a grant from NIB. We're in year 2 of our language grant, and we are now up to about 30 people that speak fluent Cree. So the reason I'm saying this is, when we first started this journey, when 92 was just being assessed in 2017, we looked around and we said, yeah, you can pound your fist and say, we want to take control of our children. But then we looked at each other and we looked in the mirror and said, are we really ready to control our healing? And when we did all of our assessment, we said we are ready to assert. We are ready to make sure that we are prepared. We started to contact our children in care. I personally started to go visit children in care, especially in foster homes, just to go feel out the foster parents, to go feel out the children and seeing, like, how's your lifestyle? How's your kinship plan? How's your culture plan? Do you know who you are? Do you know who Cowses is? Do you know how proud it is to be from Cowses? And that energy and those questions allowed me to come back home and sit down with our team and say, I think we really are ready for C-92. I do. And so we started to assess our surroundings. And I leave my introduction there as, what I'm about to explain to you is what one First Nation has been doing in this country. The pandemic has been real for 11 and a half months. But during the last 7 months, this is all we've been focusing on predominantly, rather than keeping our community and our people safe with COVID-19. So the government of Canada has been open and willing throughout this entire process. And I'm going to speak to that. The province of Saskatchewan, which we are within, our Treaty 4 territory, has been opening willing this entire time. And so, you know, I do want to get some good questions after in regards to the role governments play with this. But, you know, think of it as a car. When we launched this, we are driving the car as a First Nation. We decided where the federal government sat in the car, and we put them in the front seat, shotgun if you're talking to a youth. Then we had to say, where does the province belong in this car? And we decided that the province belonged in the car too. So they're sitting beside us, and we decided that. They didn't come in and try and dictate. They didn't come in and try and tell us. They advised and asked, and we as a team had to assess. Whoever can you put up my PowerPoint? I had some slides I wanted to share. I believe it's on. I'm trying to make sure that my screen sees what you see. I don't. I just see, hang on here. I'm just going to remove the pin. A replacement. There we go. I'm back. So really quickly, the first slide is just about who Cowes First Nation is. We're very diverse and very proud of it. We're in our heritage. Our background of Soto, which in outside Saskatchewan is Ojibwe, Cree, Nakota, a little bit of Métis heritage. We're very proud of it. We have the biggest First Nation in Treaty 4, and we have a lot of land. We oversee over 110,000 acres of land. And then in the red is our vision statement. Next slide. This is where, when we were on our healing journey, we had to understand what happened. Like, why are we in the situation that we're in? Where did Cowes give up jurisdiction to our children? Where did Canada come to Cowes and say, Cowes, we are now going to assert our jurisdiction over your children? We had to figure out what happened. And, you know, in Cowes' creation story, you know, we have been here since time immemorial. You know, who owns our land? Our children yet unborn own our land. You know, it's really challenging when you're trying to continue your Indigenous ideology, but then we got to realize that this oppressed colonial perspective has been here for over 2 centuries to 3 centuries. And so we had to educate ourselves on what happened. And so in 1874, Cowes being a signatory to Treaty 4, we agreed to nation with the Crown. We agreed to Wetaskawin sharing the land collectively, Pimachahawin making a living, Mio Pimatisawin striving for a great life. That was all a part of treaty. And so 2 years later in the PowerPoint, if you go back to the PowerPoint, Canada enforced something called the Indian Act. No one ever came to Cowes and asked us if we agreed to it or consented to it. They just enforced it. It was Canada's colonial perspective. And so to this day, Cowes never accepted the Indian Act. It's just enforced in us. In 1951 is where the province of Saskatchewan took Section 88 and asserted jurisdiction over Cowes' children. No one ever come and asked us in the province's Cowes if we agreed to it. They just took Section 88 of the Indian Act and asserted jurisdiction over our children. In 1982, the Constitution was brought to Canada. And I bring that up because you're going to hear an opinion of mine on how we have to get past this. And I'm going to use the Charter of Rights and Freedom. So I put that in this timeline, as that does play a part in our laws today. In 1991, in the province of Saskatchewan, FSIN, our federation, our provincial kind of like a gathering of chiefs to have a unity, they signed an agreement with the province, and which launched agencies within the province of Saskatchewan for First Nation. We're still under the umbrella of the province. It doesn't make us outside the 1951 oppression, but we were able to join an agency. Cowes joined YTC at that time. In 2018, on our healing journey, Cowes ratified a constitution. In 2020, Cowes First Nation, we found that the Bill C-92 was ready. The act was given royal assent. In January 8th, 2020, Cowes sent in our resolution notifying the Crown, notifying Canada that we will be empowering C-92. At that time, Cowes was working on a law that was from our inherent perspective called the Mkk Act. Mkk means striving for a better life. And so our act is driven by our inherent rights, from the creation story to the role the child plays. And so it's driven by causes. But we took 92, we took the goalposts of 92 and we put our act within it. And so our act is within the goalposts of the Bill C-92, but it is our act. It was ratified through our Constitution, and so no future government could come in and amend our act, because it's not the government's act, it's our legislation as Cowes' First Nation. So the Mkk Act, and I'll get more to that in a little bit. In 2021, and we will be launching jurisdiction April 1st, 2021. Cowes in less than a month will have all of our pieces ready to launch. Our Chief Red Bear Children's Lodge, which is the name of our agency, our CEO, everything like that, our staff, our funding, everything is ready to go April 1st. So we are just crossing the T's and dotting the I's right now. Next slide. So this is what we did. This is what we did. Now that I explained to you what happened, how did we not give up jurisdiction? So what we're saying is we're now just asserting jurisdiction. That's what we're doing. We're asserting jurisdiction. So this is what Cowes did in regards to preparing for C-92, now the Mkk Act. In 2018, we realized at the amount of children we had in protection. They were throughout the provinces, they were in some of the First Nation agencies. So we started having what you called Kinship Rejuvenation gatherings. So 4 times a year, we would invite foster parents and their children to Cowes to come and spend the day with us. We would do events, we would get the children to know who Cowes was and whatnot. In 2019, the CHRT prevention dollars were being rolled out. Cowes, we submitted our first payback, we got it. We took those dollars and we started to launch our Mkk Act draft. We worked with the Government of Canada, and we told the Government of Canada, we are ready. We are gonna put our money up front with the understanding that you have the fiduciary obligation to pay for this, but we're showing you at how serious we are, but putting our money up front. The first thing we did after we informed Canada and we started to prepare, we started our own team. We assembled our team. And so our team made up of very diverse backgrounds. Because child welfare has so many moving parts, we wanted to make sure that we did it right. We created our elders advisor. We had our elders advisor in the community. We brought a past chief, elected councillor on board. We brought other councillors on board. And then we started to say, what areas are we missing? So one of the first things is who's our friend in Ottawa? Who's our friend in that's going to be close to government, that knows government? So we found somebody in Ottawa that would be a part of the team, and he's been a part of the team to this day. We then said, who's going to be our legal? So then we had to find out, and we eventually brought someone legal on that understood the true history of colonization and understanding 92. The last thing we did, and I felt it was really promising for us, is in the province of Saskatchewan, we contacted a retired MLA who once had the file, was the MLA and Minister for Child Services, and she's retired. I contacted her and I asked her if she would like to help Cowes implement our jurisdiction. From day one, she has been so willing, and she allows us to understand both sides of the coin. And she has helped us right from then to today, making sure that we do this right. And she's also a friend of the government. So if we needed to have a discussion with the government, she was there as well. We also realized in our institutions that we're not going to allow the colonial jurisdiction to dictate us. We're not going to have a judge in the provincial system, nor a minister of social services in a province tell us how to run our Mkk Act. So what we did is we created our own judicial system, and this is also from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to action, is create your judicial system. We launched in 2019 Eagle Woman Tribunal, which is our own judicial system that will oversee our Mkk Act and totally separate any colonial perspective in telling us how we oversee our children and prevention. Next slide. So this is a team made up of the Eagle Woman Tribunal, some of our creation team, some leadership, and whatnot. So I just wanted to give you an image of some of the people. So this was back in 2019. You could tell I have the pre-COVID look there. Next slide. So in 2019, we were already preparing. We didn't have any assets under us yet. So we worked with our then agency, which was YTC at the time, and we asked them if they had any capital for us. And so what we did is we opened a 10-bedroom home on Cowes. We call it Sacred Wolf Lodge. The 10-bedroom home was officially destined for 14 to aging out females because we realized that to be an Indigenous female in this country was the toughest person, the toughest, the most challenging. So we wanted to make sure that we got right to the core of our healing. So we created this building to help those that were aging out, to make sure they had a place if they were couch surfing. It has then now expanded to a prevention place for families, which I don't have time today to explain, but I'm going to leave some contact for anybody who wants to follow up with us. So Sacred Wolf Lodge was our first building in the preparation for launching our new child welfare. Next slide. This is a picture of the ribbon cutting. There's one of our knowledge keepers, a matriarch to this First Nation, Myrna. She's cutting the ribbon. We had a nice ceremony. You could tell it was November, it was winter time, but it's a 10-bedroom home on Cowes, and it's kind of the heart now to our new agency, which we're about to build more as well. Next slide. We then started to meet with governments. We wanted to make sure that we did this right. We were driving it. We didn't have to convince anybody. This isn't negotiation. This is asserting. But we wanted to make sure that we, as the true driver, we wanted to show our respect to the governments. So we started to meet with the federal government. We started to meet with provincial governments to explain to them what we were doing. So next slide. There's a picture of Minister Miller and I gave him a book from one of the elders that wrote a book on treaty promises from Cowes. I was in Alberta with the team. We met with Minister Schultz in Alberta. In Saskatchewan, we met with ministers, different ministers. And at that later point, I met with the Premier just to constantly explain to them what we were doing. And again, I just want to confirm this. It's not a negotiation. It's asserting. And so we just went there to educate them, make sure that we answered their questions. If we couldn't answer their questions, we would come back home and assess the questions, and we would send them back proper protocol, letter, email explaining. So it was all about educating. Next slide. We then had to ratify our law because in 2020, January 1st, 2020, the act was given, it was law, it came into law. So 8 days after it came into law, Chief and Council sent in our resolution exercising section 20 and 21 of the act. And it states that you have a 1 year to give. So we gave the 1 year on January the 8th, 2020. By then, we were already in second reading of our jurisdiction called the Mkk Act. And so again, what we did is we took the goalposts of the Act 92, but we put everything in there from our inherent rights of healing for prevention, everything like that. So if anybody ever challenged it from a colonial perspective, we didn't go outside the goalpost of the 92, but the Mkk Act is custom to Cowes, and you could find it on our website. In February, March, we ratified our act, and it was law. It was prepared to be law. We put one clause in there that council would pass a resolution launching it, which we have done now. So we are going to go live April 1st, 2021. Next slide. This is a picture of myself, Pat Sparvey. She was the elected chief on Cowes in the past, our only female chief. And Marcy Large at the time was our lead for us, our admin lead. So this was the night we ratified our act back on Cowes. It was a very exciting evening. Next slide. So we then had to start to figure out how we were going to really play the role, not just assert, but how are we really ready administratively? So what we did is we met with Canada, we met with the province, and in April 1st, 2020, we exited our First Nation agency, YTC, and we signed a prevention protocol agreement with the Government of Canada and the province of Saskatchewan. So the province of Saskatchewan still had the umbrella of jurisdiction from their colonial perspective, but we now had a direct say in everything. And I'm not saying we didn't with YTC, but we just kind of left it up to YTC. This time we really had to play our key role. And on top of that, they gave us jurisdiction dollars. Canada gave us money to start to really implement our law, prepare our law and create our administration. And just to let you know that when I talked about the prevention dollars at the beginning, we did get reimbursed for those as well. So it was almost like we spend it and we get reimbursed just by submitting our receipts kind of relationship until April 2020, and we signed the agreement and they gave us money to start to create. In 2020 in June, again, this was COVID. COVID happened in March and all of us, our lives changed and we're still adjusting. So we should have been doing coordination agreement explorations as far back as January. We didn't start till June, just because Canada, COWSes, everybody else, we were in protection mode of COVID. So in June, Canada, COWSes, and Saskatchewan started exploratory discussions. We were very technical in that word exploratory because we didn't officially launch our coordination discussion. No rights holder in Canada at that moment was doing coordination agreement discussion. And where coordination agreement comes in is, I just want to let you know, in Section 20 of the Act, it states that you have 1 year to figure out a coordination agreement. And then after that, if you don't get one, that time expires. You can still launch. But the coordination agreement, I'm going to explain it in detail, is not a negotiation. It's a contract. It's a transition plan from data to files to everything, to make sure no child or family falls through the cracks in this transition. So it's not a negotiation. Next slide. So in 2020, after a month and a half of exploratory, we officially launched our coordination agreement discussions. Canada brought forward their team, which involved some people from Crown Relations, from other areas, not just ISC. They had their spokesperson. His name was James, a really good guy. Saskatchewan brought forward their team. They had a legal from the Justice Department. They had Janice from Ministry of Social Services. She was the spokesperson, and others. And then COWSes, we officially launched our team, and we balanced it with political connections to people who knew child welfare, to other areas. So we started, and we created 3 subcommittees. We dedicated every Thursday from 9:30 to 12:30, every Thursday for the main coordination table for 4 months. So just think of that. Every Thursday, we knew we were meeting about the coordination agreement. We then created subcommittees. We started a finance subcommittee, an interprovincial and data subcommittee, a legal subcommittee, and these subcommittees would meet before the meetings, and then they would bring updates. So we dedicated at least 10 hours a week for 4 months into the coordination agreement, and we discussed everything. One of the really great things about our discussions is we all put our shields down and we all looked at each other and agreed, and it was all through Zoom. I just want to confirm it was all through computer. And so not once did we ever meet in person, but COWSes drove it. I chaired it, or someone that we delegated from COWSes chaired it. So the province or Canada never drove it, we drove it. And there was really very minimal complications. We agreed to all put our shields down and speak open, that we wouldn't be talking to, publicly if we disagreed. We really had that trust to understand we were kind of the first to really launch it. So we had to make sure that we understood it. One of the hiccups was in October, the province of Saskatchewan had an election. And so we had to actually kind of pause Saskatchewan for 4 weeks because they weren't allowed to commit to anything during the election. It was kind of unique. So anybody in coordination agreement, just kind of keep in mind your elections, both provincial, federal, and yourself, because we all got confused for a few weeks, but we made the best of it. We still continued to meet. It's just that the province couldn't really say anything. We had to wait for their election to get through. In January, we had draft 23 coordination agreement. So every week we had a different draft. We had draft 6 financial agreement and how the funding would work. And here we are today in February. We have completed every step possible. Our coordination agreement is draft ready to sign with Minister Miller's signature, Minister Karn, the province, and myself on behalf of COWS's. It's not signed as of this hour. We're just working on some final technical stuff. But in the last 3 weeks, we have been meeting predominantly with Minister Carr, Minister Miller. I just want to emphasize this is not negotiation. They are not discrediting the jurisdiction. The ultimate question is who's sending us the check? Who is the fiduciary obligator? That is something that was kind of gray in the act. And so COWS's has checkmarked everything that we needed to do. Next slide. So this is really, really proud to share that on April 1st, in less than a month, COWS's will have coast to coast to coast jurisdiction over our children and prevention for our families. And it's not reserve based, and it goes back from 1951 to when we lost it, even before that, because we already knew the past system and everything was really complicated, to full jurisdiction April 1st. So we're pretty excited for that. Next slide. I believe I have 2 more slides. What is the coordination agreement? It's really key to understand a coordination agreement. Think of a coordination agreement as a contract between the federal government, who predominantly funds. They play a little minimal role, but the province plays more of a key role. And do we need a coordination agreement with every province? It wasn't defined, but what we asserted is we don't. We only need one with where our home reserve, our home government is, which is in Saskatchewan. So we do need to have some understandings with the other provinces, but once we assert, they cannot question our jurisdiction. It's not about questioning jurisdiction. It's a contract and it's a transition plan. And so it fulfills Section 20. And once you send in your resolution to Canada confirming you're going to assert, that's when your time starts, the moment that your resolution gets to the Government of Canada. In our coordination agreement, here's just kind of a blurry first page. Instead of preamble, we put a prayer in there. We talked about in our coordination agreement how, COWS's, we have our own legendary stories as to how we became COWS's, our human birth given from Creator. We talk about how for centuries, since time immemorial, our laws have been forefront. We then talk about how colonization happened. And then lastly, we define our coordination agreement like a braid of sweetgrass. And what we mean by that is that there's 3 strands in a braid: COWS's, Canada, and the province, and we're going to intertwine together to make sure that this is fulfilled. In the coordination agreement is the scope of agreement, interpretation of child, the term, the rights of COWS's, prevention services. So ultimately, it's how do you transition all these to make sure COWS's is 100% driver. Next slide. Really quickly, the Mio-Pima-Tissuin Act is well versed. Some of our areas in the Act is Section 3 is purpose of the Act, it affirms. Section 4 is rights and jurisdiction. Section 6 is principles and requirements. Now, this is really key. These are questions you must ask your rights holder nation, because if you can't answer these, it's really tough to assert. What is really the best interest of the child? When you assert your jurisdiction, you define these. You don't wait for someone to come and say, well, what does it say in the provinces? No, you define these. What is the best interest of a child? Substantive equality. What does that mean? How do we close the gap? you know, because the funding is not just going to solve education funding, housing funding. We still have some issues and challenges ahead of us, and you have to identify them. Priority for prenatal services. Really quickly, this is a personal one to me. This is why I brought up the Charter of Rights and Freedom. We were going to put in our act that the moment that a baby is in a child's womb, we have the right to help that child make sure it's not born addicted, make sure it's not born with reasons that, you know, the mom, and, you know, we're not discrediting the beautiful Indigenous moms, but sometimes there's challenges out there and it affects the baby being born. So we said, no, we're going to put prenatal in ours. And we were told that's a charter challenge. That's not a Mio-Pima-Tisawin thing. And the reason being is the rights of a woman is 100% until the child comes out of the womb. And one of the cow's values is the tribe looks after the child the moment it's in the mother's womb, traditionally the protection. And so we had to forgo that one. That one would be something in the future to discuss. We then talked about socio-economic conditions, because in our act, you cannot remove a child based on poverty, based on poor housing. That steps us up. We have to make sure our housing is prepared. We have to make sure that, you know, people who are looking after our children, that they are, you know, well equipped. And then reasonable efforts. How long do you do reasonable efforts before you do the traditional adoption? These are questions we had to explain to ourselves. Next slide. We also had to assess our institutions, our Eagle Women Tribunal, our judicial system. We have been working nonstop on our judicial system, because when we launch, we will never have to go outside our assertion of our jurisdiction to ask for permission. Everything is going to be within Cowes First Nation jurisdiction, and that's including our own judicial system. Our administration, you know, when we launch, we're not saying every child is going to move to Cowes immediately. If they're in good foster homes, good foster parents, and they respect that, you know, Cowes will play a direct role in helping with the kinship, the culture plan, bringing them home from time to time, we will help those parents to make sure that they raise successful believers. And so, but we have to make sure our administration is ready, our school, our urban office, and then support services. So that's something that you have to make sure that you assess is your own institutions within. Next slide. I think I have one more slide. Our governing structure. I just show you this because this has been changing nonstop, but this is kind of a breakdown of our governance structure. One of the differences, what we're doing is we're focusing predominantly on prevention. We're doing everything in prevention possible to make sure that we address the loss of control in political, social, spiritual, to make sure that we really give that kinship, because a lot of it is broken down due to the you know, the impact of residential school, 60s scoop, the Indian Act, imprisonment of the mind, and everything like that. And I'll give you one example. We're training kokums on Cowes right now to be prepared to go into homes. And so if at the worst case, we do have to implement protection and remove a child, why do you have to have an RCMP or tribal police sitting at the road, have a social worker knock on the door, you're continuing the trauma? How come the kokums can't go in the home, sit with the mom and dad, let them know that they have to go with them tonight, that night? One of the kokums will stay in the house so the child can sleep in their bed, wake up in the morning, eat at their table, go on their same bus and go to school, and we will help the parents to the best of our ability. That is why we're doing this, is we're ending the trauma and we're really focusing on the prevention. Next slide. And this is why we're doing it. This is a picture of Cowes Community Education Center, some of our high school students. We had a guest come in, Saul Sanderson, many know him. He was talking to us about inherent rights and whatnot. And, you know, our youth are ready. They're believers. And you can stop the PowerPoint. I have two more comments and then I'm gonna stop for questions. You know, one of the things that we found is you can only help others as much as you've helped yourself. And we understand that the residential school time, the 60s scoop, has done its toll on us. And the thing is are we really going to assert, are we going to continue the intergenerational trauma? So we want to make sure that every staff member, every community member on Cowes that helps, every friend of Cowes that helps, that you are not putting a lid or a ceiling on how much we need our children. They believe in us and they depend on us. So we have to almost reset our minds to stop fighting and to start asserting and to make sure that we got to help ourselves too in our healing. And the more we help ourselves, the more that our children are going to lift their lid on success. And my last comment in my closing before I answer questions that need to be asked is status. If there's one thing that I need us to figure out in this country is 6.1 and 6.2. Because one of the things in this act is the child has to be from registered on causes. Who defines registration? The government of Canada. So right now, parents are in the hospital. The dad might not claim the child, and the child automatically becomes a 6.2. And so that one generation, that child, it's not the child's fault that the parents were disagreeing at the time of being born, but that's outside 92. So anyways, I'll throw it back to the host. I was so excited. I had way too much things to say. I hope there's some really tough or good questions or recommendations because we're still on our journey. So I'll pause there and I need to plug in my laptop too.
Thank you, Chief Dillon. Awesome presentation. I mean, a huge scope, right? I mean, a huge conversation. You started it at a very interesting place when you were talking about your assessment around Cowessess being ready. And you talked about the framework. You have, what was it, 4,500 members, 900 in community. And I'm wondering, and then you said we were ready. And I'm wondering how the community came to that conclusion. Was there a process you went through, or was there a conversation that you did to get to a place where you said, okay, we're ready to do this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have community meetings, and this is pre-COVID. It seems like so long ago when we used to have all these in detail with a lot of KFC. That's where you attract the most Cowessess people, when you walk KFC. And, we used to talk about all different kind of things. And, we talked about Constitution and asserting our rights. We talked about decolonizing. We talked about nation building, and children in services were a part of it. And then we had our Christmas dinners. Every Christmas, we would go to 7 cities across central Western Canada. We would come back home and we would have these conversations, and no one opposed it. And so then we start to say, well, are we really ready? And so that's something that we decided that let's coincide them together. Let's heal and let's assert at the same time. So that was a decision we made.
It seems that you had a process, like you were talking about going out to 7 cities, going, outside a community to connect with your community. So you feel that was an important part of that, preparing the community to be ready for this kind of conversation?
Absolutely. And it wasn't like a questionnaire, or it wasn't like a vote. It was about, conversation. And, you talk about children in care. It doesn't matter what political side you're on in your community. It doesn't matter if you, if you're off reserve or on reserve. Nobody attests to that we need to fix child welfare. And so, the main question is, should we go full bore? Should we just join another agency? And the thing is once we assessed it, we're like, we're very proud. We feel we're ready. Our institutions, need a little adjustment. And we made that bold decision a year and a half ago to say, let's just implement.
I have a question from the crowd. And what other laws does Cowessess have in effect? Like, you have a constitution. I'm wondering if there are other laws you have in place.
Yeah, thank you very much. So our Constitution was ratified in 2018. So prior to that, our Constitution was always here. It just wasn't written. And so now we have a written Constitution, as we have a history of oral laws. In 1982, Cowessess exited the Indian Act with elections. And so we've had our Custom Election Act since 1982. It's been amended a few times. So right now, as of today, Cowessess, in our framework from our nation building inherent rights perspective, outside the Indian Act, we have the Constitution, we have an Election Act, and we have the Mio-Pima-Tisuin Act. In draft right now, we have an Education Act. We have a financial act that we're working on. One day we'll have a Lands Act, and these are all outside the Canada's colonial perspective. And I just got to add in there that we're very cautious with how we exit the colonial perspective. We're not going to, I'll give an example. We're not going to exit the financial obligation of the Indian Act and join the First Nation Financial Authority, or we're not going to join the First Nation Land Management Act, because those two were ratified approved by MPs in Ottawa, Cowses is really going to make sure that when we exit the Indian Act, we're going to do it within our wording. And that's where the Mkk Act is a good example. Is we stayed within the goalpost of a Canadian colonial legislation, but we built it to where it is so Cowses custom and no one could amend it but us in the future.
There's another question from the participants. Were the institutions built up / assessed before the notification of coordination agreement, or was that work done during the year-long time?
Yeah, so we coincided some of these. The Eagle Women Tribunal was at the beginning. That was one of the first things that was brought to us as well. Are you going to just build this and still have the province have their judicial system? And we said no. And then we assessed, is there any other judicial systems that we can join? Like, is there a Treaty 4 judicial system? Is there something? And we found a couple First Nations had some bylaws. And so we said, well, why don't we just full bore create our own judicial system? And it's not just for the Mkk Act, it's for anything within Cowses. If there's appeals in election, if there is questions to the elected officials, how do we protect our Constitution and protect our laws and our bylaws and our policies? And so that's the role of the Eagle Women Tribunal, which is our judicial system. Other institutions that we have built up is you got to figure out what kind of funding agreement you want. At the end of the day, we built Chief Red Bear Children's Lodge. We have a board of governors. We have a CEO. They have staff. They're their own entity. We did not register them under a provincial non-for-profit because that's, again, is we're going back to the colonial perspective. So we had to work out a lot of those details to make sure that we respect this being beside the colonial perspective, but we are really going to decolonize this approach to where no one could ever come in and tell Cowses what we're going to do with our children. We're going to make sure that our laws are healing, that our laws are real, and that our institutions that support us could keep us accountable and keep us transparent.
So was in your constitution, that's where you would define how you pick your tribunal and their scope of responsibility. That's in the constitution portion, right? Is that how it works?
It is not.
Oh.
Yeah, so right now we will be ratifying our Eagle Women Tribunal in the next 2 years. So once you ratify, no chief and council can ever change it. It has policies and has procedures. At this time, because we coincided them together, we put all of our focus on the Mkk Act and launching. Because this council of the day and the nation is very supportive in what we're doing, we will be ratifying the Eagle Women Tribunal in the next 2 years prior to the next election. And then that way that will coincide. One of the things we realized is we can't do everything at the same time. We have to we'll confuse our citizens, we'll confuse ourselves. We need funding for all this. So Eagle Women Tribunal is a council resolution implemented. And within the next 2 years, it'll be ratified. And that's a good point should it be in our constitution or should it be ratified as its own legislation within Cowses? That's something that we are finalizing.
It comes back to a community conversation, right, in terms of where you place those kinds of things. I have another question from the crowd. How did the Convention on the Rights of the Child factor into the development of your nation's act?
Ask the question one more time. I just want to make sure I heard it right.
Sure. How did the Convention on the Rights of the Child factor into the development of your nation's act, if at all? I added
yeah. So we have continuously assessed the convention, the law, the 92, the CHRT. We have done everything to assess the best interest of the child, to make sure that we're not just copy and pasting a colonial perspective and just overseeing it ourselves. And I'll give an example. We have in our act that the child has a very strong voice in the decision. We wanted to make sure, and I'll give you an example. Say a child doesn't want to come to Cowses, or say a child is so upset because something that happened to this individual that they need time to heal. And they're not willing to, maybe come to a ceremony. Maybe we're having a ceremony. In our act, if the child says no, we must make sure that we assessed all reasons as to why the child said no. And if it's for the best interest of that child's recovery, we will respect that. And so, we got a lot of these approaches, not only from the convention to the 92, but even regards to, what are some cases, what are some CHRT for funding purposes for gaps, but to really empower that child to prepare that child to be an adult and be their own decision maker.
I have another question here. I guess it has to do with how you, the non-incorporated bodies, right? You outside of the colonial system. So the question is, how do you get funding for those societies that are outside the colonial system? I guess that's why they have these Incorporations Act, right? To do all those, to get funding for the most part.
When we meet with ministers, as a chief and as council that work beside, we work beside one another, we educate and we explain and we implement. And if we feel that they're going to fund us, we won't wait. We will just upfront our own money and start to do it. And everything we've done so far has been funded in return. Our Eagle Women Tribunal, we had to really let our fiduciary partners understand what it is. And so as we're launching it, we upfronted our own dollars, our own source dollars, and explained it and started submitting receipts, and we come to an understanding in the investment. One of the things you got to understand is prior to treaty, prior to Indian Act, we had all this. The reason we don't today is because of colonial oppression. And if we want to talk about prevention, that's what COUSES is doing. We're getting back to that state institutional-wise mindset prior to us being colonized. So we will submit all those receipts to government saying, this is what we're going to do. But we're not just going to walk into the office and say, give us money for this. And they're going to look at us and say, well, do you have your plan ready? We walk into these offices with our plan ready. We're kind of aggressive and say, well, we've already been kind of doing it. We do have some receipts if you want to look at them too. And so, it's just a matter of showing that there's a rights holder nation that is ready to do this. That has kind of been our mindset. And this federal government has really been open-minded in pretty much everything we've approached. The only challenge we're faced with right now is housing. We all know renovations on reserves, underfunding in CAIAS, and CAIAS is a government term for funding. We know those are underfunded. So we're really trying to prepare our homes to be ready. And it's a challenge. So we're talking about universal housing, rental regimes and stuff like that. But those are just minor things that indirectly affect us.
I was curious about, how you were doing that conversation around the establishment of your tribunal. And the first thing you did is look around. Is there anything else out there that might be useful? I'm wondering if there's your sister communities or communities around, or the Cree communities, Soto communities around, might be interested in using the same tribunal. I don't know if that conversation started, but it seems like something that might be, if you were looking for it, I'm sure someone else might be looking for it in the future.
I leave this openly, and I take direction by council in my community, but everything we build on COUSES is open for non-COUSES people to come and join us one day. That's not only our child welfare, but that's our school. If any local RMs want to come and join, to get their kids to come to our school, we will teach them the Indian control of Indian education. If people want to come and assess our Eagle Women Tribunal, I know that, COUSES, that has always been our mentality, is to welcome others. We're just happy that we created it from its core outwards. And I'll give you an example of our Eagle Women Tribunal. There's 3 on reserve, 3 off reserve, and 3 non-COUSES citizen, which 2 of them are non-Indigenous on our Eagle Women Tribunal. We were somewhat criticized by some individuals on causes as to why do you have someone off the reserve, or why do you have a non-Indigenous person on our judicial system? I thought this was sovereign. I thought this was inherent. It is. We created it from its core outwards. But, you know, when you want an unbiased decision, you want to make sure that you have many different approaches to how a decision has to be made. So that's something that we're proud of, is, you know, we're welcoming to make sure our institutions are unbiased as much as possible.
Fascinating stuff. The other thing I was wondering about, and I don't know if you had the answer, I don't even know if I have the answer, but I don't even know how Bill C-92, and you were talking about your agreements with other provinces, right? Because you're going to take responsibility for all Cowessess children, no matter where they reside. And I don't know, maybe it's not a question we can answer, but I was wondering, you know, how the provinces are now disputing the jurisdiction in terms of C-92, like Quebec and then other provinces are joining it. I'm wondering if there are Cowessess children in Quebec. You know, I wonder if there would be an issue there. I'm just curious. I'm wondering if maybe we have to go see a legal counsel or something. But I'm wondering, because you said you made the agreement with Saskatchewan. I'm curious about the other provinces.
Yeah, no, that's we've been watching Quebec's response. We have identified 160 children in protection across this country. None in Quebec as of this hour. We're still assessing. The thing is the provinces have been so tight-lipped with many data that when you want to assert, first you got to find, first you got to realize where they are. And that's how much work we have to do. Like, one of the questions is, what kind of data system are we going to use when we're asserting? Are we going to implement a provincial system? Are we going to ask if AFN can create something across this country? Are we going to do it on our own? Are we just going to go private? And so, you know, back to the main question, I mean no disrespect to people who might agree with Quebec's decision to challenge this, but Cowessess never gave up jurisdiction. We were just colonized, and now we're asserting, and our children, we're going to control the faith, we're going to control the future. And if anybody's going to challenge it, I think that you can use your money elsewhere and invest it in upstream to help prevention. Cowessess is going to do this. We're going to do it well. But if any province challenges us, we're prepared to answer, we're prepared to educate, but this is not negotiation. We already are asserting. I know it kind of sounds political and a little too confident, but I mean, we assess the history. I don't see where this can be challenged.
I'm kind of agreeing with you in terms of, you know, where you're coming from, the arguments are coming from. I'm just curious, like you said you identified 126 children or 120 children across the country in care. I guess if you have gaps, right, that might have impacts on your, you know, your budgets, right, and how you take care of those children if you don't have all the information. So I can see why you have to be putting the provinces to the feet to the fire, right? Give us that data. If you have one of our children, you have to let us know. So.
And, you know, to address that, one of the things we're doing is our first year funding is going to be a 1-year agreement, just to really get an understanding of how much funding we need. And then from there, you know, it's up to us. Do we want a 5-year? Do we want a 10-year? We you know, have been working with the government to understand how funding works. We don't want to under cost ourselves. We would rather over cost and then just, you know, ask for forgiveness later on where we spend, if I say that in a comical way. But, you know, that's the thing is we're still identifying, like the provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta are good. Manitoba, all right. BC's data system is so confusing because they're just like silos over there. So how do you really identify how to identify? And then from there, how do we transition to our data system?
Well, I guess I'm curious about, you know, think about the work that was the presentation just before in terms of the Migma Authority. I wonder, is there a future of agreements between First Nation organizations like child and family organizations? I'm thinking, maybe I'm just dreaming.
You know, absolutely. You know, prior to colonization, nation to nation, tribes to tribe, Cowessess is, you know, a rights holder in this country. And anybody that wants to follow up with us after this presentation, give us a few more weeks to implement. Give us another couple weeks to massage out our little kinks. And then from there, we are ready to really share the story on how this journey has went from idea to creation to implementation and asserting our children's rights to making sure prevention and jurisdiction is with us.
Here's another question from the participants. What will the relationship look like with the child's advocate in Saskatchewan and Cowessess First Nation?
Yeah, no, we're doing it on our own. Like the relationship will be pick up the phone and call one another, but we don't have to ask them for a final decision. We want to make sure that there's no door closed, because when you need assistance, as we are going to help others, we want to make sure that they'll pick up the phone for us. But their act does not supersede ours. And then secondly, if others want to give us, if there's gaps that we're missing, we're going to create to make sure, like this day one, we know that there's going to be a couple little areas that are going to be scratching the head. What do we do here? That's where, you have to understand that this isn't about fighting. This is about understanding those areas and creating laws to make them make them work. But we just want to make sure that our system and our voice is to healing of Cowessess First Nation.
I guess the question that makes me think about if Saskatchewan has a child advocate, obviously the child advocate has a role to voice concerns to the government, right, of a child who might have some difficulty. I'm wondering, let's say, for example, Cowessess now has assuming jurisdiction. So I'm wondering, is there consideration to have a child advocate within Cowessess, right? So that there's like this third independent body that can be an advocate for your own children within its own government, right? If you know what I mean.
So at this time in the Mkk Act, there is a option for the child, for the family, to put in a complaint, and that complaint will go directly to the Eagle Women Tribunal. It'll go to with a copy to go to the CEO. In our Mkk Act, we empower the CEO to be the decision maker. And then anybody could challenge, in this case, her name's Eva Coles, anybody could challenge her that is directly affected by the decision she made. It's all defined in our act. And who oversees it is Eagle Women Tribunal. And then there's a officer within that. So, we are just making sure that no colonial acts will come in and try and say that, this was outside of the Mkk Act. We have, but at the same time, we're going to pick up the phone and talk to one another. If it's just a conversation, we'll have a conversation. If there's a complaint made outside, we'll make sure that it goes to Eagle Women Tribunal, but we're not just going to have someone come in and start to pick and choose what jurisdiction we have.
One more question, Chief. I have only a few seconds here, but there's a question here. Is there any training for the judicial system on understanding and respecting your laws? So I guess I don't know if it's external and probably both, right? Internal and external, understanding the judicial system that you're creating.
So we do have plans to educate council, educate citizens, and I'm talking internal first, because we have to realize we all have to decolonize personally to this. This summer, we were gifted to have a master's student come here and create an orientation package to help staff decolonize themselves, to look at this as a real jurisdiction and not just copy and paste from the colonial perspective. But now to the judicial system, we do have to create educational understandings as to the role we play. Cowessess is not here to just say, Awas, go away, we're going to do this. That's not our approach. And create means go away. Sorry, I say it Awas. What we're saying is, listen, we're here to educate you on our healing journey. And if you want to ask how we're doing it, please set up a time. We'll figure it out together. So, I think in a year from now, if I was to present at the next forum, if there's 1 year from now, I'll probably have so many stories as to, the little hiccups we went through, the great things we went through, but, we're not waiting any longer. We feel very confident to launch, and we are launching in less than a month.
Thank you very much, Chief Delorme. I think that someone's got to break trail, and you're way out there breaking trail for the rest of us. And I'm sure people will be contacting you, seeing how it's going, what lessons they've learned, and what could they do within their communities to learn from your successes and learn from perhaps the lessons that you've learned moving forward. So thank you very much, Chief Delorme. It was a fascinating conversation. You got me into it, and I was ready to go for another couple of hours, but I'm sure you probably have some work to do. So miigwech for that, Chief Delorme, and do take care. And we'll hopefully see you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. With that, what I'd like to do is take a little 10-minute break, everybody. I thought the chief did a fantastic job. I'm thinking he's probably has a big crowd outside the chief or the council office applauding right now for his presentation. So it was a great presentation, a good overview of what's happening in Cowessess. So we much appreciate that. Let's take 10 minutes. Let's take 10 minutes for a quick little break here. Let's reconvene at 3 o'clock. And we'll start our next agenda item, which is right on time, 3 o'clock. Of course, right on time, 3 o'clock. Viability considerations for transitioning to First Nation jurisdiction over child and family services. Ooh, that's going to be a heavy one. So we better get another cup of coffee and reconvene at 3 or at the top of the hour. See you soon, everybody. On est de retour, nos enfants de notre avenir, service à l'enfance et à la famille des Premières Nations et autodétermination.
Nations and self-determination. Welcome to all.
To our virtual session number 3, we are joined by Eileen Vandenberg, who is going to speak as a partner at Alexander, Holborn, Bowden, and Lang, and the leader of the firm's administrative law, appellate advisory and information and privacy practices. So welcome, Eileen, to our virtual session. She will be speaking to, and I see the presentation up here on my screen, liability considerations in transitioning to First Nations jurisdiction over child and family services. Easy topic, shouldn't be any issues here. So we'll go right into the content. Eileen, the floor is yours, so welcome.
All right, thank you, Matthew. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Salish peoples, the Musqueam First Nation, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. It's a cloudy day, but no snow. If we could go to the next slide. I want to just talk a little bit about the scope of this presentation today and sort of some of the premises that it's been developed on. What I intend to do is to identify a number of the legal principles that have been applied by Canadian courts in claims against child welfare authorities, which are primarily in the current system, provincial governments, and how do those principles possibly apply to Indigenous governing bodies who are being sued, again, in a Canadian court for damages suffered by a child that they have assumed the care of. I don't intend, and it's beyond sort of the scope of this presentation, to address disputes that may fall within dispute resolution mechanisms that are set up by Indigenous governing bodies. I just want to note that this is a complex area of law that is being applied to a complex sort of web of relationships. And so there's a number of legal principles that are sort of guiding, and those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to run through sort of a high-level overview of some of the topics that I'm going to be addressing. So what is the legal basis for the liability of governing bodies who are providing child and family services? There's claims in negligence, and as we'll get into, those are the most common kinds of claims brought against authorities and agencies who are providing these services. And there's some specific issues that I'm going to address. One of them, which is the concept of a non-delegable duty, how the duties conflict or don't conflict between family members and children in care and how that's addressed. Vicarious liability, and I'm going to touch on some of the provincial legislative statutory immunities for good faith acts in delivering these kinds of services and how that affects liability. We could just go quickly to the next slide. I'm going to then move on to claims for breach of fiduciary duty. I've included some slides at the end of my presentation on the kinds of damage awards. I doubt that I'll get to them in any detail given the time that I have, but they're there just to set out some of the basic principles. And then finally, I'm going to just kind of highlight some ideas about managing the risks. There's one thing to tell you what they are, but I think you need a little handy chart of ways that you can work around them. So we can go to the next slide then. So negligence is, as I've noted, the most commonly pleaded cause of action. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on the concept of what a duty of care is. And I set out there what a plaintiff must prove to establish a claim in negligence. And you can see that the first one is that the plaintiff is owed a duty of care, and then you get on, there's a breach of that duty, and there's damages that were reasonably foreseeable and caused by that breach. We're going to get into some of those concepts in more depth in the next few slides. If you could just go to the next slide. There's some, from sort of a review of some of the case law, this is sort of a list of some of the most commonly common types of claims that are brought against child welfare service providers. And I'm going to use some of these terms interchangeably. That's quite often the way that authorities are referred to in the case law. And one being, these all sort of are around the issue of apprehension. So starting with a failure to apprehend a child in need, and then once a child has been apprehended, a failure to supervise or negligently supervising a caregiver where the child has been placed, negligent placement, which would be failing to properly identify any issues with either a foster family or other caregiver, and then negligent performance of other kind of specific statutory duties that may be specific to different provincial legislation. You can just go to the next slide. So to understand where the liability comes from, the legal basis of a negligence claim is the duty, as I've noted. And in the cases, the duty of care will be imposed if it's already been recognized in the precedent. So there are a number of authorities out there, some of which I will be touching on, that very firmly establish a duty of care on the part of an authority towards a child in care, and relating to specific kinds of circumstances. Where there's what is sometimes called a novel claim or duty of care alleged, there's a three-part test that the courts apply that is called the ANDS analysis, and ANDS is simply an old case from the UK House of Lords, which set out a way of analyzing whether or not a duty of care was owed in certain circumstances. So that's to certain individuals in relationships with the defendant or the public body that was being sued. So if we go to the next slide, and this is the basic test, and I think it's important to appreciate these principles because they kind of come back to looking around your system of child and family services and identifying who out there you may owe a duty of care to based on not just the act, the federal legislation, but your own laws that may have been passed in order to implement the provision of child and family services directly. So the three steps are looking at, is the risk of the type of damage that's been suffered by this individual reasonably foreseeable to that class of individuals? So if we talk about children, is a damage suffered by a child, for example, a child who might be suffer abuse and then suffers damages later on in life in terms of loss of ability to earn income and other losses, is all of that reasonably foreseeable? What is the relationship? Is it of sufficient proximity between the governing authority and the child so it's just to impose a duty of care? And that question, I think, is easily answered in these kinds of cases where it's an authority that has assumed responsibility over children, that I think the duty of care, or the relationship issue of the duty of care, is easily managed. Are there any policy reasons to negate a duty of care? And we'll come to one example of that when I'll talk briefly about that in later slides, where the courts have recognized that although there may be some duty of care owed to family members, parents and family members of children who are apprehended, that the agencies or the authorities' primary duty is to ensure the best interests of the child and the decisions around apprehension, and that duty cannot conflict with a duty to a parent, so that the courts have said we don't recognize a duty of care to parents in that situation because it puts the authority in an impossible situation. If we could just go to the next slide. So there's two kind of ways in which a governing authority, and this is under the Act, this would be the authority that has established the laws to administer a child family service family services program. So they can be directly liable based on their own acts or omissions in delivering those services, or they may be vicariously liable for the acts or omissions of agencies or others who are employed or retained to deliver the services on their behalf. And so vicarious liability can apply even if the authority itself hasn't done anything wrong, but somebody who they've employed or contracted with to provide services has, and the law recognizes a vicarious liability in that relationship. We'll talk about that as we go forward. Switch to the next slide. So certainly, when you're talking about institutional liability, governments and governing bodies, they act through their employees. In the case law, the existing case law, the provincial child welfare bodies generally act through there's an individual that's identified in the legislation, quite often called the director, it could be the superintendent, where the statutory duties are placed. So you will see it's very common in provincial statutes that the duties are on the director. And so that is what we would call the direct liability. So if the director or employees working for the government fail to comply with the duties that are set out in the statute or act negligently in performance of those duties directly, then they are directly liable to the child in care who may be seeking damages for that breach of duty. That those duties can still come home to the governing body, even if they have delegated the performance of those duties to an agency or another service provider under the doctrine of non-delegable duty. And if we can just go to the next slide. So the non-delegable duty doctrine provides that a party, and in most cases this is a public authority, a government, who has a strict positive duty to do an act, cannot escape liability by delegating that work to another. And this has been applied in the child welfare cases around the obligations of provincial authorities when children are taken into, are apprehended and taken into the care of the province. So, and the theory around recognizing a non-delegable duty ensures that that governing body remains responsible for performing those statutory duties, even if they're performing them through a delegated agency. And so it recognizes the importance of that particular duty or duties on the public body or the public authority. Just go to the next slide. So there's a decision which is now coming up on 18 years old now from the Supreme Court of Canada, which dealt with a lot of these issues. This is a 2003 decision, but what the Supreme Court of Canada said with respect to non-delegable duties in the context of child and family services gets to what in fact the government is actually doing. So when the government is apprehending a child, it's assuming custody of the child, becoming responsible for the care, maintenance, and physical well-being until the child is then placed in another home, either a foster home or perhaps under laws passed by First Nations who are entering into this area, the home of a caregiver as defined in the Act. And the court has said this is a non-delegable duty. If you go then to we'll just stay on this slide for a moment. Sorry. In the KLB decision, the Supreme Court sort of analyzed the steps in the apprehension and placement of a child and noted that there were different duties on the authority at different stages. So once the child had been apprehended, the authority had a non-delegable duty for the care and maintenance until that child was placed in a home of some description under the legislation. The authority retained the non-delegable duty with respect to the well-being of that child if it became aware that the foster home or other place where the child had been, the other home where the child had been placed was not in the best interests of the child. There was some issue going on or the child was not doing well. So it's a knowledge-based trigger. If the authority became aware of those circumstances, then it had a non-delegable duty to address them. What it did, what the part of the stages or the process that the non-delegable duty did not apply to is the assertion that the authority had the duty to ensure that no harm came to the child while the child was in a foster care or another setting, another home. That was beyond the scope of the non-delegable duties on the government authority. You just go to the next slide then. So in the case, if it's a breach of the non-delegable duty, even if the performance of that duty, the operational aspects were delegated to an agency, that the authority, the public authority, the government authority remains liable, and it's considered a vicarious liability for the actions of whatever entity it's delegated the performance of the duty to. Even if they've done nothing wrong, they chose a proper agency, and the agency acted negligently in some aspect, the government authority will still remain liable for the damages. And delegation can happen, certainly under provincial statutes in this area, can be expressly authorized in the statute, or it can just be done on the basis of a contract for services. And even if it's authorized in the statute that certain things can be delegated, if they're considered to be non-delegable duties, that you can delegate the performance or the operation of the task, but you cannot delegate the legal duty down to the agency, even if the statute said it's okay to have an agency do this work. So it's sort of separation of the legal duty from the actual performance of the duty. Go to the next slide. So in the case of Indigenous governing bodies who may be exercising their jurisdiction in this area or planning to, and are establishing their own legal regime, this is a concept that should be considered, particularly in the area of apprehension of children. And generally, the case law to date has found the non-delegable duties based on this governing statutes. So that the concept will need to be addressed in the context of any laws that are being passed, at least to be considered in the context of any laws that are being passed to deliver these services. It's also possible that the non-delegable duty may be found to be rooted in a more common law approach because of the analogy between the government taking custody of a child and the normal, what you would expect the duty of a parent to be, and that you can't, as a parent, there are certain things certain duties you owe to your children that you can't delegate to others. That question hasn't really been addressed in any depth in the case law, I think primarily because of the way that services have been delivered to date, where there's these fairly sophisticated statutes in place. If we just move on to the next slide. In addition to the concept of non-delegable duty, a governing body may also be held liable for wrongful act or omissions of their service providers and employees, including where the wrongful conduct was intentional. And this touches on issues around employees or for caregivers or foster parents abusing or neglecting children that are in their care or under their supervision. Can we just go to the next slide and just come back? So the test to apply to establish vicarious liability is the relationship between the governing body or the agency, if that's what it is, and the wrongdoers, such that a claim for vicarious liability is appropriate. And then a sufficient connection to the wrongdoer is assigned tasks such that the conduct is a materialization of the risks created by the governing body or agency, essentially its employer. And in essence, the concept or the rationale, the policy reason around the imposition of vicarious liability is to ensure that where, and in this field, to ensure that where children are damaged by the acts of people who have been placed in close relationships with them by a government or a child welfare agency, that the best scenario for that child to recover damages and for the whatever breakdown in the system occurred to be corrected is to visit that liability back on the government that sort of set up the system and set up the potential for the damage to the child. So The exceptions to that that have been identified in the cases, and I'm going to go back to the KLB case, so if we just move to the next slide. In KLB, the court looked at the claims that had been made by the foster children about the treatment that they received from the foster parents. And in KLB, the court analyzed the relationship between the provincial government and foster parents and determined that it wasn't sufficiently close enough for vicarious liability to be imposed on the province. And some of the analysis in that case really circled around the difference between foster parents as what the court described as independent contractors under the law to employees, and contrasted the situation of children placed in the care of an institution where they were abused or neglected by employees of that institution. So they weren't placed in a home where the expectation was that they would receive parental-like care from the foster parents. They were placed in an institutional setting where the care was provided directly by the employees of the institution. And that was the distinction between why vicarious liability would be imposed on the institution for the institutional care, but not on the province where the care was in a foster home. And there are, of course, always exceptions to the general rule, and there have been cases where governments have been held vicariously liable for abuse of children in their care. There was one case here in British Columbia where foster parents who were given the care of a very vulnerable infant and with sort of special instructions about physical closeness and what the infant needed to thrive. The province was found vicariously liable for the damage that infant suffered at the hands of the foster parents, who apparently, when the child cried incessantly, were shaking the child, and the child suffered some significant injuries. And that was, in terms of the special circumstances in the placement, a case where the court found the relationship close enough to impose vicarious liability on the province. And it's also a way, quite frankly, for courts, if they can find a way around this sort of no vicarious liability for foster parents, if they can find a way around it in a case that sort of cries out for someone to provide recompense to the child, and it doesn't look like the foster parents are going to be able to do so, to find liability on the province or whatever governing authority is there to ensure that the child is compensated. And just to distinguish some other cases involving foster parents where vicarious liability was not imposed, but direct liability was found on the province with respect to what happened to children in foster care. And that could include things like failing to properly investigate prospective foster parents or a caregiver prior to placement of the child, to make sure that the home would be adequate for the child. Failing to supervise the child's stay with the caregiver, and although there's no expectation, of course, that the province is sort of in the house every day, that there is an expectation that there will be some ongoing supervision by a social worker or someone else on behalf of the province to make sure that things were going well. And also failing to investigate complaints made by the child or others about the care that they were receiving in the foster home. Those are all examples of cases where the province has been found directly liable to the children, not on the basis of vicarious liability, but on their own acts of negligence. Just before I leave the issue of vicarious liability, I just want to touch on joint and several liability, because it can affect the scope of the liability that is visited on a provincial government or an Indigenous governing body. Joint and several liability will apply if there are a number of defendants who are all liable for the damage that's been caused to a child. And that can be whether the defendant was simply negligent, or whether the defendant committed an intentional act, what's described as an intentional tort, which can be an assault or abuse of any kind. That group of defendants are jointly liable to the plaintiff, and the plaintiff can go after any one of them for the whole of the damage award. And that is, again, another way that the court can ensure that if there's any risk of non-recovery of the damages, because there may be one or more of those defendants who are not going to be able to satisfy a judgment, that won't be visited on the plaintiff. It will be visited on a defendant who has been found liable. So generally, that will be the defendant with the deep pockets, or the insurance, or some other way to ensure that the judgment will be paid. And so even if a government or a governing body is not vicariously liable for the acts of another party, they may, in essence, end up being responsible for it with the imposition of joint and several liability. And the several part of the liability simply means that the defendant who is asked to pay has the right to recover the proportionate shares from the other defendants. And again, it's the risk then is put on that defendant to recover rather than on the plaintiff. We could go ahead then to the next slide. And this is taken from the Act. This is Section 10 about the best interests of the child. And this is leads into my next point, which is about the conflict in duties when you've got you've got a child, you've got parents, you've got family, you've got community, and how do you manage the different duties or interests of all of those groups, those individuals and groups. So the Act is quite clear, and I'm just going to focus on the last part of it, that in the case of decisions or actions relating to child apprehension, the best interests of the child must be the paramount consideration. So that clearly states that, where a decision has to be made on apprehension, the best interest of the child rule, and the decision can be made even if it's not in the interests, obviously, of the parents or the family, and not in accordance with what they are advocating for. So we can just go to the next slide. And this statement in the Act, this explicit recognition, is consistent with the case law that has developed in the child welfare authorities do not owe a duty of care to parents and other family members in child apprehension cases. And I note that in the Act, and I'm assuming in laws that may be passed by Indigenous governing bodies for child and family services, that there are procedural rights and other participatory rights granted to parents, families, and communities. But I also note in the Act that the language consistently refers to where there are those competing duties or competing considerations. It's only where giving effect to that competing consideration is consistent with the best interests of the child. So it's not just in Section 10, it's throughout the Act. If we can just go to the next slide, I can see that we're coming up on the time here. So this decision, SILAP's Secure Treatment Center, is one that has been referred to and cited a number of times. And this is around the issue of family or parents suing a provincial agency or government for damages because of their decision on apprehension of their child. And the courts have been very clear in this field in particular that the imposition of a duty of care on a child protection decision by a provincial government or other agency creates what it calls a genuine potential for serious significant conflict with their transcendent statutory duty to promote the best interests, protection, and well-being of the children in their care. And so cases that have been brought by parents against provincial authorities have been dismissed on that basis. And courts have made it quite clear that that's the basis for it is the conflict. Okay, the next, I'm just going to skip over the next slide. I'm talking about standard of care, and this I'm not going to spend too much time here because I can see that we're running out of time for questions. So really, the standard of care is really an analysis of what is it that you need to do in order to satisfy the duty of care. So how do you perform that duty? And so this slide says it can be in the legislation, there could be policy documents, common law standards. If you're a member of a particular profession, like a social worker or a nurse or a physician, there are standards of care set out in by your governing bodies. So I will just move on then to the next slide, or sorry, this one, just noting that there are minimal national standards set out in the Act, and again, anticipate that there will be laws passed that will also set out standards of care. We just jump to the next slide, and this, most provincial statutes have what's called a statutory immunity clause. And what it does is bar claims for losses or damage that are suffered by someone by reason of or an act or omission. So that's a wrongful act committed in good faith in the exercise of the powers. Can you just jump to the next slide? And the rationale that's been kind of reflected in the case law for authorities to include statutory immunities in child protection matters is sort of this recognition that there are challenges in making decisions about the care of children where outcomes are unpredictable, and this is to permit social workers and others to do their jobs without fear of making a mistake. So this is very much, and I want to emphasize this, very much a policy or political issue for Indigenous governing bodies as to whether or not they want to follow what most provinces have done in including a statutory immunity. What statutory immunity generally does is requires a plaintiff who's suing for damages to establish that the acts or omissions, if it's a failure to do something, was done in bad faith, and that's a higher standard than just you had a duty and you didn't perform it. You were negligent in not performing it. So that's a question that I think I'll just leave with you, but it is obviously it does limit recovery for children who may have suffered damage, and so it's a question that may not be palatable or to include in laws, but it's there in the laws that the provinces have applied. Okay, I'm just going to jump. Just go to the breach of fiduciary duty. Next slide after that. There's an alternate way, and this is normally an add-on to many claims for damages against provincial governments, is the breach of fiduciary duty. And that's the duty that's owed by the province who has taken custody of a child to that child. And it's a duty of loyalty and obligation to act in a disinterested manner. Go to the next slide. It's different. It has some crossover with the claim in negligence, and but it's different in the sense that it's based on this concept of loyalty and to act in the interests of the child and not in the interests of someone else. And an example of where a fiduciary duty may be breached, and it could be a parent who knows that their child is being abused by a visitor to the home, relative, and says nothing because it does not want to, the parent does not want to disturb a family relationship or disrupt the home. That's a breach of the fiduciary relationship between the parent and the child. And I think that move on. And again, that can be the case if the parent is actually the province. So it is a more difficult claim to establish against an institutional body. And again, this is from the KLB decision, and it's I think quite aptly sets out why there is a fiduciary relationship between, in this case, it was the superintendent of child welfare and the children that were in care. If we can just then skip over the next 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, second to the last slide, if we can get to. I'm just skipping over the discussion about damages. So just on managing the risk. So I've given you a lot of sort of dense legal principles. Matthew described my presentation as heavy, and I'm sorry that it is. But I think the takeaway, I think, is what can you do to manage these risks that are arising out of a fairly complex legal landscape, and also a complex web of relationships that you're trying to manage. So clear operational policies and protocols for how you're going to do things are really important. How you hire and train employees, how you supervise your employees is also very important. How you supervise and support caregivers, where you're caregivers who you're putting children in their home. Possibly limiting liability through laws. We talked briefly about how the provinces have done that. And then really the gold standard is get insurance. And it's sort of beyond the scope of this presentation to talk about all of the different issues around liability insurance. But it's out there, it's available. You need to talk to an insurance broker to find out what the market is like and what is there. But that's the best risk management tool. And I'm sorry I have not left very much time for questions, but I'm happy to answer whatever is out there.
So thank you very much, Arlene. Thanks. Just for our participants, the top right-hand corner, there's that little icon with the hand up. So if we press that little icon and you can ask questions there. I guess I'm looking at this last slide here. You had development of clear operational policies and protocols in terms of managing the risk. Is there some kind of document that the governing body, or say that you want to set up these kinds of governing bodies, could look at in terms of the areas where liabilities are possible and how to mitigate them through policies and procedures? I guess I'm trying to think of like a checklist, make sure, that you do these things are within the policy. These are within the policy, the visits to the home are with the policy, the hiring of policy, all these. Is there a way or something that communities can use to ensure that their policies and procedures are doing the best they can to limit the kinds of liabilities that might arise?
Well, I would think the first source to go to for what has been done is to consult with your provincial government and get their policies, because they'll develop policies on everything, and then you at least have sort of a template, which of course you can choose to accept or disregard certain policies, but it will outline the scope of what certainly the province considered needed to be covered by policy and tailor that. I mean, I think it'll be probably more than what you want, but you can tailor it to the issues that you see or that you want to address in your own policies. I think that's the best source to kind of get some guidance on what policies are recommended.
The other question I had was just around, we had previously, right before your conversation or before your presentation, we had Chief Delorme on, and he was talking about the creation of his own judiciary system. So I don't think it would eliminate liability, because you could take it to their own judicial system if there's a perception of wrongdoing, I would imagine. When does it, I guess, what's the model? When does it get externalized? If you know what I mean. When does it go from an internal judicial or judiciary system to something that might be influenced by all the precedent that you're talking about?
I think it will depend very much on the laws that are passed, and there are lots of considerations about when. Certainly this is a different area than other kinds of bodies passing bylaws, or that what it's called tries to oust the jurisdiction of the courts, because this is different, because this is a governing body, a government in essence, who is passing this law. It's kind of beyond its scope. I think it's certainly a question that you want to address with whoever you have advising you on your laws, and whether or not that's an area that you want to do within your own dispute resolution system, or set up your own court, because they can be complicated claims, and whether or not you want to take on that additional burden, and if so, how do you manage that in the legislation? Because what you are, it affects people's rights who are affected by the decisions made by the governing body on these issues. So that, I think, is a trickier sort of political question as to whether or not that's what you want to do.
I guess when you talk about precedent, are you creating new precedent? If you're creating your own judicial system, are you going to reside, or does it default like the Supreme Court of Canada, like the decisions you were talking about? I guess those are all things that we'll figure out moving forward.
Yes, big questions. Those are very big questions.
Eileen, thank you very much. I realized it was completely comprehensive. We didn't even get to the liability portion. I think you skipped over 6 slides there. And I realize that there's lots of content here. So maybe what we can do is, what I'll do is that if there are other questions out there, you have your contact information, we will make sure that we close that loop. I don't have it right now, but I'm thinking everyone is just trying to think about what just happened.
Yeah,
And then figure out, okay, how does this fit within our world? And then saying, okay, here are my questions. And I'm thinking those questions will come maybe later. So we might be calling on you for some clarifications or questions moving forward.
yeah, I'm happy to answer questions as people think about it and try to digest it over the next several days.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Do take care. And I guess you're in the office because I saw your mask on there. People.
Yes, I am.
That's nice. So do take care. And thank you very much for your presentation.
All right. Thank you.
With that, I think that brings us to the end of our agenda items, which was plenty. I mean, today we started our day with Elder Sackney, who put a lot of pressure on us, to make sure we had all our stuff done here today. But I mean, I see him on the sidelines. I'm trying to make him laugh here on the sidelines, but I'm getting ready to bring him on stage. So today we had a crazy day. It was busy, busy, busy. We transitioning from delegated authority to First Nations jurisdiction. We heard from the Migma authority, or the Migma experience. We had Cowesses from Saskatchewan talking about the almost implementation of their act, which is going to be happening soon. And we definitely follow up, come back in about a year and see how things are going. But definitely blazing the trail there. Cowesses is blazing the trail in terms of what's possible out there by First Nations communities. And then Eileen came and talked to us about all this liability stuff. And I was like, okay, where is this? How does this all fit? And how does this all work? I was kind of at a loss during the presentation too. So that's why I was thinking that if you have questions moving forward, do send them in because I'm thinking that even Eileen's it's lots of complicated stuff going on there and lots of issues to be considered when you're doing this kind of work. And of course, we heard from the regional chief. And my lessons learned from my chairing these things that I'm going to forego doing much of a overview of the previous sessions because the regional chief does a fantastic job. Tells us what's happening so far, told us what happened at the last meeting, and also tells us what's going to be happening during the meeting that we're currently attending. So that was a great little start for our session. I want to remind everybody that we have virtual session 4 coming up in these series of gatherings, and it's entitled Upholding the Best Interest of First Nations Children. That's going to be an interesting conversation too. Obviously, this is not an easy topic. Lots of things to consider. This is our 3rd session. And what has been done by the Assembly is actually splitting it up nicely into 3 different portions and in 5 different portions to allow for the amount of time that you need to reflect and think about each of these topics items. Just a moment here. I'm seeing that my control room is talking to me here. I'm told it's on March 30th. So the control room told me that the next session's on March 30th at 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern. So that's when our next session is, March 30th. So circle that on your calendar. Upholding the best interests of First Nations children, which is a continuation of this conversation. And I want to thank everyone for the support. I know Encore is in the back there supporting us. I want to thank Carolyn and Sharon for helping and putting this all together. I want to thank the FN staff who puts all this content together and brings all the people together to make sure that you're informed and get the best information to you so that you can do the rest, the appropriate thinking. Are you ready for this? I think the chief from Cowesses really put it well. Are you ready for this? What work do you need to get done to get ready for this? What partnerships might be out there? What opportunities are out there? So I'm always thinking about building on what we have. So if we know what's out there, we can always build and build and build and build and create something that we'll all be proud of moving forward. And our children will always be first priority for all of us. So with that, miigwech to everybody, miigwech, gigwa min minoa. Until we see you again, I want to defer or pass the chair on to our elder, who will close our session. Upon the closing of the elder, we'll stand adjourned. I do want to thank you all for joining us. We will see you on March 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next conversation. Igwamin, everyone, and do take care. And I want to make sure that our elder's ready to join us. He's taking some important phone calls at the moment now. He's getting calls directly from the creator, I believe, so he's ready and prepared to close our meeting. Elder Sackney, it's all yours. Just make sure you unmute Elder before we start.
Miigwech Matthew. Muna tawega gilbehen oma nagashkaton. Mina gapichi. Kamiek oma upisam. Mikasu upisam. I won't really close this session because we'll be meeting again at the end of the month, which we refer as the Eagles Month, March. In that fire, I just lower. Then when we get together, I'll fan it so it burns once again. You know, when we meet and when I pray, I use this sage sweetgrass, and I burn it while you folks are talking. So I just want to thank all the presenters and all the people that come in to listen. Ogomaganesta. Mingwashnetan Lutano, Kachigishgatayan, Kanagachihaya, Ogomaganesta, Nagachihipogo, Koyas Witutuma. I also acknowledge the great creator for allowing us to meet this way, for you to come and speak and to look after you during these uncertain times. And I give you a bit of and I also like to thank all the workers, the people in the background who prepare this kind of session. I just want to extend my biggest thank you to them for doing this wonderful work so our children are being looked after. You know, it's for our children that we hold these sessions. Also, I'd like to thank our leaders who are leading the way in this cause. Also, I thank the chiefs and councils across this country who always have the children at the best interest of their hearts. And may we always keep our children, and when we speak of them like we did today, may they always be kept at the basis of our thoughts and also at the base of our hearts. Thank you, all of you. Look after yourselves well. And to all my people right across Turtle Island, I pray. What James way?
Watch you, elders. We miss you down here. We miss seeing you and having you around. Before I go, I just want to thank the elder and also put up on the screen here. If you need to talk, we realize these are not easy topics. 1-855-242-3310. If you, it's a wellness line and hopefulwellness.ca. So do take care of yourself.
Matthew, before you go, our area has been having technical problems with the internet. Going off and on. It's crazy because I'm at an education center and it affects the students with our virtual classes. So they said they're going to fix it by March 10th. Well, I hope they forgive our bills until then too. So you take care, Matthew.
You too, Elder. Take care of yourself, and do take care, everyone. And we'll see you on March 30th.
Okay.
Okay.